Murasaki Shikibu, Genji Monogatari, The Tale of Genji Chapter 7, The Festival of Red Leaves. The imperial visit to the Red Sparrow Court was appointed for the 10th day of the godless month. It promised to surpass in splendor any former display, and the palace ladies were much upset at being excluded. The emperor himself could not bear that Fujitsubo should be deprived of the sight, and resolved upon holding a magnificent rehearsal within the palace. Prince Genji performed the waves of the blue sea. To no Chujo danced with him, yet though in both grace and accomplishment he exceeded ordinary performers, beside Genji, he looked like a fir upon a mountain contrasted with a cherry tree in bloom. There came a wonderful instant when the setting sun's beams struck him, and the music swelled abruptly. Never before had the spectators beheld feet so light in their tread, nor a head so finely poised. And in the song that follows the first movement, his voice had the sweetness of the Kalavinka whose melody is Buddha's law. The dance moved and entranced the company so that at its close, the emperor's eyes were wet, and all the princes and great gentlemen wept aloud. When the song ceased, and smoothing his long sleeves used for the dance, he stood waiting for the strains to renew, and at length the livelier air of the second movement began then indeed. With that flushed, eager countenance, he more than justified the name Genji the Shining One. Princess Kokiden was ill, pleased to see so much enthusiasm stirred by her stepson's beauty, and with a sarcastic air observed, "He is altogether too beautiful. Before long, a god will descend from the sky to carry him off." Her younger waiting, women caught the spite in her tone and felt somewhat ashamed. As for Fujitsubo, she kept telling herself that if it were not for the guilty secret between them, the spectacle before her would be filling her with wonder and delight. As it was, she sat as though in a dream, scarcely conscious of what passed about her. She was now returned to her own rooms. The emperor accompanied her. "At today's rehearsal," he remarked, "the waves of the blue sea was flawless." Then, seeing that she made no answer, he asked, "What did you think of it?" "Yes, it was very good," she at last managed to reply. "The partner did not strike me as ill either," he continued. "There is always something about the carriage of a gentleman and the use of his hands which marks his dancing from that of professionals. Some of our leading dancing masters have certainly trained their own children into clever performers, yet they never possess the same freshness, the same charm as the young people of our class. They applied themselves so thoroughly to the rehearsal that I am afraid the festival itself may seem a poor thing. No doubt they took such pains because they knew you were present at the rehearsal and would not witness the actual performance." On the following morning, she received a letter from Genji. "What of the rehearsal?" How little the spectators guessed of the tumult that all the while was boiling in my mind. He appended to this the poem. "When sick with love, I yet sprang to my feet and capered with the rest. Knew you what meant the fevered waving of my long dancing sleeve?" He then entreated secrecy and prudence, and so the letter closed. Her reply showed that, despite her agitation, she had not been wholly insensible to what had captivated all other eyes. Though from afar a man of China waved his long dancing sleeves, yet did each motion of his fill my heart with wonder and delight. To receive such a letter from her was indeed unexpected. It pleased him that her knowledge extended even to the court customs of a distant land. Already, there was a regal quality in her words. Yes, that seemed the destiny awaiting her. Smiling to himself with pleasure, he spread the letter before him, holding it with both hands as a priest clasps a sacred book, and looked at it long. On the day of the festival, the royal princes and all the great gentlemen of the court were present. Even the heir apparent joined the procession. After the music, boats had swept round the lake, dance succeeded dance, both Korean and of the land beyond the sea. The whole valley rang with music and drums. The emperor insisted on treating Genji's rehearsal performance as a kind of miracle or heavenly token, and ordered special services to be chanted in every temple. Most people thought this quite reasonable, but Princess Kakaidan sulkily declared she saw no need for it. By imperial command, the ring was formed indifferently of commoners and noblemen chosen from the whole realm for their grace and skill. The two masters of ceremony, Sayaman no Kami and Ayaman no Kami, took charge of the left and right wings of the orchestra. Dancing, masters and others were charged with finding performers of unusual merit and training them for the festival in their own houses. At last, beneath the red canopy of tall autumn trees, 40 men stood in a circle with flutes, and to the music they made a strong wind from the hills sweeping the pine. Woods added its fierce harmonies. Then out of a whirl and scatter of leaves, the dance of the blue waves suddenly burst forth in all its glittering splendore. Rapture seized the spectators akin to fear. The maple, wreath Genji wore had been battered by the wind, and thinking the few red leaves that remained looked forlorn, the minister of the left plucked a spray of chrysanthemums from those growing before the emperor's seat and wove them into the dancer's wreath. At sunset the sky clouded, and it seemed as if rain might fall. Yet even the weather seemed to feel that such a pageant would not be seen again for long, and until all was done not a drop fell. His exit dance, crowned now with that unspeakably lovely wreath of many hued flowers, surpassed even that marvelous instant at the rehearsal, and to the enraptured onlookers seemed like the apparition of another world. Humble, ignorant folk perched upon tree roots or beneath some rock, or half, buried in deep banks of fallen leaves, few were so hardened that they did not shed tears. Next followed the autumn wind, danced by Lady Jokyoden's son, still a mere child. The later performances drew little notice, for the audience had had its fill of wonders and felt that whatever succeeded could only impair the memory of what had gone before. That night Genji was raised to the first class of the third rank, and To no Chujo advanced to an intermediate standing between the first and second classes of the fourth rank. The gentlemen of the court were all promoted 1 degree. Yet though they celebrated their good fortune with the customary rejoicings, they were well aware they had merely been swept along in Genji's wake, and wondered how it had come about that their fortunes were thus curiously linked to those of the prince, who had brought them this unexpected boon. Fujitsubo returned to her own house, and Genji, waiting for a chance to visit her, was seldom at the great hall, and so fell into disfavor there. It was soon after this that he brought the child Murasaki to live with him. Ai heard a rumor to the effect that someone was living with him at his palace, but did not know it was a child. Under these conditions, it was natural she should feel much aggrieved. Had she only flown into an honest passion and reproached him as most would have done, he would have told her everything and set matters right. As it was, she increased her icy reserve, and thus drove him toward those very distractions meant to rebuke him. Not only was her beauty so flawless as inevitably to win his admiration, but the mere fact that he had known her far longer than the rest made him feel a tenderness of which she seemed quite unconscious. He believed, however, that her nature was not fundamentally narrow and vindictive, and this gave him hope that she might one day relent. As he came to know little Murasaki better, he grew more content with both her looks and her character. She at least gave him her whole heart. For the present, he did not intend to reveal her identity, even to the servants of his own house. She continued to occupy the somewhat remote western wing, which had now been made comfortable, and there Genji visited her constantly. He gave her various lessons, copying exercises among them, treating her in all ways as though she were a little daughter brought up by foster parents and now come to reside with him. He chose her attendants with care and commanded that they do everything possible to make her comfortable. But no one except Koremitsu knew who the child was or how she had come to be living there. Nor had her father discovered what had become of her. The little girl sometimes dwelt upon the past and then felt lonely for her grandmother. When Genji was present, she forgot her sorrow, but in the evenings he was seldom at home. She was sorry that he was so occupied and missed him terribly when he hurried off each night to some unknown place. Yet she never grew angry with him. Occasionally, he would be away for 2 or 3 days at the palace or great hall, and on his return would find her very tearful and low. Then he felt as if he were neglecting a child of his own, whose mother had died and left it in his charge. And for a time, he grew uneasy about his nocturnal excursions. The priest was puzzled when he heard that Genji had taken Murasaki into his house, but perceived no harm in it and rejoiced that she should be so well provided for. He was gratified also when Genji begged that the memorial services for the dead nun should be celebrated with special pomp and solemnity. When he went to Fujitsubo's palace, anxious to see whether she was keeping well, he was met by a troop of waiting women, mayabas, chunegins, nakatsukasas, and the like, and Fujitsubo herself, to his disappointment, showed no sign of appearing. They reported faithfully on her condition, which somewhat eased his anxiety, and had passed on to general gossip when word came that Prince Hayabakyo had arrived. Genji went at once to speak with him. This time Genji thought him extremely handsome, and there was a softness, a caressing quality in his manner. Genji watched him more closely than he let on. That was feminine enough to make his ties with Fujitsubo and Murasaki immediately prominent in the observer's mind. It was then, as the brother of one and the father of the other, that the newcomer at once created a sense of intimacy, and they fell into a long conversation. Hayabakyo could not but notice that Genji was suddenly treating him with an affectionate manner hitherto undisplayed. He was naturally gratified, little guessing that Genji had in a sense become his son-in-law. It was growing late, and Hayabakyo was about to join his sister in another room. Bitterly, Genji recalled how long ago the emperor had brought her to play with him. In those days, he had run in and out of her chamber at will. Now he could address her only by precarious messages. She was as inaccessible, as remote as two people could be, and finding the situation intolerable, he said politely to Prince Hayabakyo, "I wish I saw you more often. Unless there is some special reason for seeing people, I am lazy about it. But if you ever care to send for me, I should be delighted," and he hurried away. Amiabu, the gentlewoman who had contrived Genji's meeting with Fujitsubo, seeing her mistress sink into steady gloom and vexed at her belated caution, was all the while doing her best to bring the lovers together again. But days and months passed, and still her efforts were fruitless, while they, poor souls, strove desperately to put from them a love that proved a perpetual disaster. At Genji's palace Shonagon, the little girl's nurse, finding herself amid unimagined luxuries and comforts, could only attribute this good fortune to the efficacy of the late nun's prayers. The Lord Buddha, to whose protection the dying lady had recommended her daughter, had indeed made handsome provision. There were, of course, certain drawbacks. Ai's hauteur was in itself to be feared, and it seemed to have the consequence of driving Prince Genji to seek diversions here and there, which would be very unpleasant for the little princess once she was old enough to perceive them. Yet Genji's evident preference for the child's company did not leave Shonagon altogether hopeless. It being 3 months since her grandmother's death, Murasaki came out of mourning at the end of the godless month. It was nevertheless deemed proper, since she was to be reared an orphan, that she should still avoid patterned stuffs, and she wore a little tunic of plain red, brown, or yellow, in which she nevertheless looked very smart and gay. He came to see her, before setting out for the New Year's Day audience at court. "From today onward, you are a grown-up lady," he said, and standing smiling at her, he seemed so amiable that she could not bear the idea of his leaving. Hoping he would stay and play a while longer, she set out her toys. There was a little doll's kitchen 3 feet high, fitted with all the proper utensils, and a whole collection of small houses which Genji had made for her. She had them spread over the floor so that it was hard to move without treading on them. "Little Inu broke them yesterday," she explained, "when he was pretending to drive out the old year's demons, and I am mending them." she showed herself greatly distressed. "What a tiresome child he is," said Genji. "I will mend them for you. Come, you must not cry on New Year's Day," and he went out. Many servants gathered at the corridor's end to see him depart for court in his splendor. Murasaki, too, went out and watched him. On returning, she dressed one of her dolls in a fine gown and enacted a performance she called Prince Genji Visiting the Emperor. "This year," said Shanagan, looking on with reproof, "you must really try not to be such a baby. It is time. Little girls left dolls when they are 10 years old. And now that you have a kind gentleman hoping to be your husband, you ought to try and show him you can behave like a little grown-up lady, or he will grow tired of waiting." She spoke thus because she imagined it must pain Genji to see the child so intent on play, and thus reminded of her mere infancy. Her admonition made Murasaki for the first time aware that Genji was to be her husband. She knew about husbands. Many of the maid servants had them, though such ugly ones, and she was glad that hers was so much younger and handsomer. Still, the mere thought that she was to have a husband showed she was beginning to grow a little. Her childish ways and looks were by no means so grievous as Shanagan supposed, for they went far toward allaying the suspicions which the child's presence might otherwise have aroused in Genji's puzzled household. On his return from court, he went at once to the great hall. Ai was as perfect as ever, and as unfriendly. This never failed to wound Genji. "If only you had changed with the new year, had become less cold and forbidding, how happy I should be," he exclaimed. But she, having heard someone was living with him, at once convinced herself she had been utterly supplanted and put aside. Hence she was more sullen than before, yet he affected not to notice, and by gaiety and gentleness at last drew an answer from her when he spoke. Was it that being 4 years his senior made her seem so unapproachable, so exasperatingly well regulated? But that was unfair. What fault could he find in her? She was faultless in every respect, and he perceived that if she was sometimes out of humor, it was solely due to his own irregularities. She was, after all, the daughter of a minister, and of the minister who above all enjoyed the greatest influence and esteem. She was the only child of the emperor's sister, and had been brought up with a full sense of her own dignity and importance. The least slight, the slightest hint of disrespect came to her as a complete surprise. To Genji, such pretensions naturally seemed exaggerated, and his failure to make allowances for them increased her hostility. Ai's father was vexed by Genji's seeming caprice, but as soon as he was with him, he forgot his grievance and was always extremely kind. When Genji was about to leave the next day his father, Law came to his room and helped him to dress, presenting with his own hands a belt famous far and wide as an heirloom. He smoothed the back of Genji's robe that had become a little creased, and short of bringing his shoes, performed in the friendliest manner every small service. "This," said Genji, handing back the belt, "is for imperial banquets or other great occasions of that kind. I have others much more valuable," said the minister, "which I will give you for the imperial banquets. This one is not of much account save for its curious workmanship," and despite Genji's protests, he insisted on buckling it round him. Performing such attentions was his chief interest in life. What did it matter if Genji was irregular in his visits? To have so agreeable a young man coming in and out of one's house was the greatest pleasure he could imagine. Genji made few New Year's visits. First he went to the emperor, then to the heir apparent and the ex-emperor, and after that to Princess Fujitsubo's house in the 3rd Ward. As they watched him enter, the servants remarked how much he had grown and altered over the past year. "See how he has filled out," they said, even since his last visit. Of the princess herself he was allowed only a distant glimpse. It gave him many forebodings. Her child had been expected in the 12th month, and her condition was now causing anxiety. That it would at least be born during the early weeks of the new year was confidently assumed by her household and reported at court. Yet the first month passed, and still nothing occurred. Rumor began to whisper that she was affected by some possession or delusion. She herself grew doleful. Convinced that when the event at last came she would not survive it, she worried so that she became seriously ill. The delay made Genji more certain than ever of his own responsibility, and he privately arranged for prayers to be said for her in all the great temples. He became firmly persuaded, whatever might happen concerning the child, that Fujitsubo herself was utterly doomed when he learned that about the 10th day of the second month, she had safely given birth to a son. The news brought great joy to both the emperor and the whole court. The emperor's fervent prayers for her life, and for that of a child which she knew was not his, distressed and embarrassed her. Whereas when Kakaiden's maliciously gloomy prognostications were reported to her, she was at once filled with a perverse desire to frustrate their hopes and make them appear ridiculous to those to whom they had confided their forebodings. By a great exertion of will, she shook off the despair that had weighed upon her and began gradually to recover her old vigor. The emperor was impatient to see Fujitsubo's child, and so too, though he had to conceal his interest, was Genji. Accordingly, Genji went to her palace when there were few people about and sent in a note proposing, since the emperor was so impatient and etiquette forbade his seeing the child for several weeks, that he should look at the infant himself and report to the emperor. She replied she would rather he saw it on a day when it was less fretful, but in truth, her refusal had nothing to do with the child's temper. She could not endure the thought of his seeing it at all. Already it bore an astonishing likeness to him. Of that she was convinced. Ever lurked in her heart the tormenting specter of fear. Soon others would see the child, and instantly the secret of her swift transgression would be known. What charity would gossips have toward such a crime if a single hair were awry? Such thoughts continually tormented her, and she again grew weary of life. From time to time, he saw Amiabu, but though he still begged her to arrange a meeting, none of his many pleadings prevailed. He also pestered her with questions about the child until she cried out, "Why do you go on troubling me like this? You will be seeing him yourself soon, when he is shown at court." Though she spoke sharply, she knew well what he suffered and felt deeply for him. The matter could not be discussed except with Fujitsubo herself, and she was impossible to see. Would he ever again meet her alone, or communicate save through notes and messengers? Half weeping with despair, he recited the verse. What guilty intercourse must ours have been in some life long ago, that now so cruel a barrier should be set between us? Amiabu, seeing that it cost her mistress a great struggle to do without him, was careful not to dismiss him too harshly and answered with the verse. Should you see the child, my lady would be in torment, and because you have not seen it, you are full of lamentations. Truly have children been called a black darkness that leads the parents' heart astray. And drawing near, she whispered to him, Poor souls, it is a hard fate that has overtaken you both. Thus often and again, he returned to his house desperate. Fujitsubo, meanwhile, fearing Genji's constant visits might attract notice, began to suspect that Amiabu secretly encouraged him and lost the same affection for her. She did not wish this to be perceived and strove to treat her as before, but her irritation at times betrayed itself, and Amiabu, feeling her mistress estranged and at a loss to find cause, was very miserable. It was not until the 4th month that the child was brought to the palace. It was large for its age and already displayed lively interest in its surroundings. Its extraordinary resemblance to Genji escaped remark by the emperor, who tended to think handsome infants all much alike at that age. He became intensely devoted to the child and lavished every sort of care upon it. For Genji, he had long had such partiality that, had it not been for public opposition, he would certainly have raised him to the heirship. That he had not been able to do so had often grieved him. To have produced such a magnificent son and be obliged to watch him grow up merely as a nobleman had always rankled. Now, in his old age, a son had been born who promised equal beauty and lacked the tiresome defect of a plebeian mother. And upon this flawless pearl, he lavished his whole affection. The mother saw little chance of this rapture lasting and meanwhile lived in a state of agonized apprehension. One day, as he had been wont to do, Genji played music for her at the emperor's behest, and his majesty, taking the child in his arms, said to Genji, "I have had many children, but you were the only other one that I ever indulged in this fashion. It may be my fancy, yet it seems to me this child is exactly like what you were at the same age. However, I suppose all babies are very much alike while so small," and he looked admiringly at the fine infant. A succession of violent emotions, terror, shame, pride, and love, swept through Genji while these words were spoken and flushed his face in rapid changes. He was almost in tears. The child lay crowing and smiling so exquisitely that, hideous as the situation was, Genji could not but be glad it was thought to resemble him. Fujitsubo, meanwhile, sat in a state of embarrassment and agitation so painful that a cold sweat broke out upon her as she sat by. For Genji, this clash of contrary feelings proved unbearable, and he went home. There he tossed upon his bed, and, unable to distract himself, resolved after a while to go to the great hall. Passing the flower beds before his house, he noticed a faint green film already upon the bushes, and beneath them, the takanatsu already in bloom. He plucked one and sent it to Amiabu with a long letter and an acrostic poem in which he said he was touched by the flower's likeness to the child, but hinted also that he was distressed by the child's likeness to himself. "In this flower," he added despondently, "I had hoped to see your beauty enshrined." It was all and roughly scribbled in a faint hand, yet a comfort to Amiabu to have such a message to return. Genji knew well that it could lead to nothing. How many times had she sent him such messages before? Yet as he lay dejectedly looking at the note, the sight of her handwriting stirred in him a frenzy of unreasoning excitement and delight. For a time he tossed on his bed. At last, unable longer to remain idle, he sprang up and went, as he had so often done, to the western wing to seek distraction from his agitated thoughts. Approaching the women's apartments with his hair loose upon his shoulders and wearing an odd dressing gown, he played a tune on his flute as he walked to Amu's Murasaki. He peeped in at the door. She lay there like the fresh, dewy flower he had recently plucked. She had grown a little spoiled, and having heard some time ago of his return from court, was a little cross he had not come at once. She did not run to meet him as usual, but lay with her head turned away. He called to her from the far side of the room to get up and come, but she did not move. Suddenly he heard her murmuring the lines, like a sea flower that the waters have covered when a great tide mounts the shore. They were from an old poem he had taught her, in which a lady complains of neglect by her lover. She looked bewitching as she lay half sullen, half coquettish with her face hidden in her sleeve. "How naughty," he cried. "Truly, you are becoming too witty. But if you saw me more often, perhaps, you would grow tired of me." Then he sent for his zithern and bade her play. It was a large Chinese instrument with 13 strings. The 5 slender middle strings puzzled her, and she could not extract a full tone. Taking it from her, he shifted the bridge, tuned it lower, struck a few chords himself, and bade her try again. Her sullenness passed. She began to play prettily. Sometimes, when a stretch was too great for one small hand, she helped herself with the other so deftly that Genji was entirely captivated, and taking up his flute taught her several new airs. She was quick and caught the most complex rhythms at a single hearing. Indeed, she had in music, as in all else, the talents that delighted him. When he played the Hasaragusari, though its name seemed absurd, it is an excellent tune. She accompanied it, childish in touch yet in perfect time. The great lamp was brought in, and they began to look at paintings together. But Genji was due to go out that night, His attendants were already assembled in the courtyard. One of them remarked a storm was brewing. He ought not to delay. Again, Murasaki was unhappy. She did not look at the pictures, but sat with her head in her hands, staring at the floor. Stroking the lovely hair that had fallen across her lap, Genji asked if she missed him when he was away. She nodded. "I am just the same," he said. "If I miss you for a single day, I am terribly unhappy. But you are only a little girl, and I know that whatever I do you will not think harshly of me. While the lady I go to see is very jealous and angry so that it would break her heart if I stayed with you too long. But I do not at all like being there, and that is why I go only briefly. When you're grown up, of course, I shall never go away. I go now because if I did not, she would be so terribly angry with me that I might very well die, and then there would be no one to love and care for you at all." He had told her everything he could, yet she remained offended and answered nothing. At last, he took her on his knee, and to his great embarrassment, she fell asleep. "It is too late to go out now," he said after a time, turning to the gentlewomen in attendance. They rose and fetched his supper. He waked the child. "Look," he said, "I did not go out after all." She was happy anew, and they supped together. She liked the odd, irregular meal, but when it was done, she again watched him anxiously. "If you are really not going out," she said, "why do you not go to sleep at once?" Leaving her at such a moment for his room, he felt the reluctance of one about to set forth on a long and perilous journey. It often happened that, at the last minute, he decided to stay with her. Naturally, some report of his preoccupation leaked out and reached the great hall. "Who can it be?" asked one of Ai's ladies. "It is the most inexplicable business. How can he have suddenly become entirely wrapped up in someone of whom we had never heard before? It cannot, in any case, be a person of breeding or self-respect. Probably it is some girl employed at the palace, whom he has taken to live with him to hush up the affair. No doubt he circulates the story that she is a child merely to mislead us." This opinion was shared by the rest. The emperor, too, had heard someone lived with Genji and thought it a pity. "You treat the minister very badly," he said. "He showed you the greatest devotion since you were a mere baby, and now that you are old enough you behave so toward him and his family. It is truly ungrateful." Genji listened respectfully but made no answer. The emperor began to fear his marriage with Ai had proved unhappy and regretted having arranged it. "I do not understand you," he said. "You seem to have no taste for gallantry, and so far as I can see, take no interest in any of the ladies in waiting whom one might expect you to find attractive, nor do you trouble about the various beauties who in one quarter or another are now in request. But instead, you must needs pick up some creature from nowhere and wound others' feelings by keeping her as your mistress." Although advancing in years, the emperor had by no means ceased to be interested in such matters. He had always insisted his ladies in waiting and palace servants should be notable for both looks and intelligence, and the court at that time was full of interesting women. There were few among them whom Genji could not with the slightest word or gesture have made his own. Yet perhaps, because he saw too much of them, he did not find them attractive. Suspecting this, they would sometimes toy with him with some frivolous remark. He answered so staidly that they perceived a flirtation would be impossible, and some concluded he was dull and prudish. There was an elderly lady of the bedchamber who, though admirable in other ways and much liked and respected, was an outrageous flirt. It surprised Genji that despite her years, she showed no sign of reforming her reckless coquetries. Curious how she would take it, he one day jested with her. She seemed quite oblivious to their age difference, and at once counted him an admirer. Slightly alarmed, he yet found her company agreeable and often spoke with her. But chiefly because he feared being laughed at if anyone discovered him, he refused to be her lover, and she resented it. One day, she was dressing the emperor's hair. When finished, His Majesty sent for his valets and went with them into another room. Genji and the elderly lady were left together. She was more full than ever of languishing airs, her dress to the last degree fashionable and elaborate. Poor creature, he thought, how little difference it makes. And passing her on his way out, the temptation to give her dress a tug grew irresistible. She turned swiftly, eyeing him above the rim of a marvelously painted summer fan. The eyelids beneath which she ogled were blackened and hollow. Wisps of hair projected untidily about her forehead. There was something singularly inappropriate about this gaudy, coquettish fan. Taking it from her, he replaced it with his own and examined it. Upon paper coated with a red so thick and lustrous you could see your reflection, a forest of tall trees was painted in gold. At the side, in a hand old, fashioned yet not without distinction, the poem about the forest of Araki was written. He guessed the fan's owner had penned it alluding to her advancing years, and expected him to make a gallant reply. Turning over how best to divert this extravagant ardor, he could think only of another poem about the same forest. But to that it would be ill, bred to allude. He felt very uneasy lest someone should enter and see them together. She, however, was at her ease, and seeing him remain silent, recited with many arch looks the poem. "Come to me in the forest, and I will cut pasture for your horse, though it be but of the underleaf whose season is past. Should I seek your woodland?" he answered, "my fair name would be gone, for down its glades at all times the pattering of hoofs is heard." And he tried to get away, but she held him back, saying, "How odious you are! That is not what I mean at all. No one has ever insulted me like this before," and burst into tears. "Let us speak of it another time," said Genji. "I did not mean..." And freeing himself from her grasp, he hurried from the room, leaving her in great dudgeon. She indeed felt prodigiously old and tottering after his rebuff. His Majesty had watched the ill-assorted pair from behind his screen, toilet long since completed, and laughed. "I am always told," he remarked, "that the boy takes no interest in members of my household. But I cannot say he seems unduly shy," and he laughed aloud. For a moment she felt embarrassed, but any relationship with Genji, even public repulse by him, seemed a feather in her cap, and she made no defense against the emperor's raillery. The story quickly circulated at court. It surprised no one more than To no Chujo, who, though aware Genji was given to odd experiments, could not believe his friend had embarked on the fantastic courtship rumor attributed to him. There seemed no better way to see whether it was conceivable to regard the lady thus than to make love to her himself. The attentions of so distinguished a suitor went far to console her for her recent discomfiture. Her new intrigue was, of course, carried on in secrecy, and Genji knew nothing of it. When he next met her, she seemed very cross, and, feeling sorry for her because she was old, he resolved he must try to console her. But for long, he was occupied by tiresome business of many kinds. At last, on a very dismal rainy evening as he wandered near the Umaiden, he heard the lady playing most agreeably on her lute. She was a performer of merit, and often summoned to play with the professional male musicians in the imperial orchestra. At that moment she was somewhat downcast, and in such a mood, played with yet greater feeling and vehemence. She sang the melon grower's song, admirably, he thought, though the song was inappropriate to her age. So might the voice of the mysterious lady at O Chu have sounded to Po Chu, when he heard her singing on her boat at night, and he stood to listen. At the song's end, the player sighed heavily, as if spent by the ardor of her serenade. Genji approached, softly humming the Azumea. "Here in the portico of the eastern house, rain splashes on me while I wait." He would gladly have passed on, but thought that too unkind, and seeing someone approaching her room, stepped inside and began to talk lightly on indifferent topics in a style which, though forced, she found entertaining. It was intolerable thought To no Chujo, that Genji should be praised as quiet and grave and constantly rebuke him for frivolity, while all the while he carried on many interesting intrigues which he, out of mere churlishness, kept entirely secret from his friends. For long Chujo had waited for a chance to expose this sanctimonious imposture, and when he saw Genji enter the gentlewoman's apartment, he was delighted. To give him a little scare at such a moment would punish him for his unfriendliness. He slowed his step and watched. The wind sighed through the trees. It was very late. Surely Genji would soon be dozing. He indeed looked half asleep. Chujo stole on tiptoe into the room, but Genji, only half dreaming, instantly heard him, and not knowing Chujo had followed, imagined it was a certain commissioner of works who long ago had been supposed an admirer of the lady. The thought of being discovered thus by that important old gentleman filled him with horror. Furious with his companion for exposing him to such a risk, he whispered, "This is too bad. I am going home. What possessed you to let me in on a night when you knew someone else was coming?" He had only time to snatch his cloak and hide behind a long folding screen before Chujo entered, and going straight to the screen, began to fold it up. Though no longer young, the lady did not lose composure in this alarming crisis. Being a woman of fashion, she had more than once found herself in an equally agitating position, and now, despite her surprise, after a moment's thought, she seized him by the back of his coat, and with a practiced though trembling hand pulled him away from the screen. Genji still did not know it was Chujo. He half resolved to show himself, but remembered his odd, inadequate dress and disordered head, gear, and felt if he ran he would cut too strange a figure, so hesitated. Wondering how long Genji would take to recognize him, Chujo said nothing, but assumed the most ferocious air and drew his sword. Thereupon the lady, crying, "Gentlemen! Gentlemen!" flung herself between them in a posture of dramatic supplication. They could hardly restrain laughter. It was only when painted and bedizened that she retained any superficial semblance of youth. Now this woman of 50, 7 or 8, disturbed by a sudden brawl in the midst of her amours, created the most astonishing spectacle, kneeling at the feet of 2 youths in their teens and beseeching them not to die for her. Chujo, however, kept on his alarming air and continued ferocious. But now that he was in full view, Genji realized at once that Chujo had known all along who he was and had been amusing himself at his expense. Greatly relieved, he seized the scabbard Chujo had drawn from and held it fast lest his friend escape. Then, despite his vexation at being followed, burst into uncontrollable laughter. "Are you in your right mind?" said Genji at last. "This is a very poor sort of joke. Do you mind letting me into my cloak?" Chujo snatched the cloak from him and would not return it. "Very well then," said Genji. "If you are to have my cloak, I must have yours." And with that he unfastened Chujo's belt and began tugging his cloak from his shoulders. Chujo resisted, and a long tussle ensued in which the cloak was ripped to shreds. "Should you now get it in exchange for yours, this tattered cloak will but reveal the secrets it is meant to hide," recited To no Chujo, to which Genji answered with an acrostic poem complaining that Chujo, with whom he shared so many secrets, should spy upon him in such a way. Neither, however, was truly angry, and setting their disordered garments right, they departed. Alone, Genji found that the thought of having his movements watched had upset him greatly, and he could not sleep. The lady felt utterly bewildered. On her floor she found a belt and buckle which she sent to Genji the next day with a complicated acrostic poem likening these stranded properties to the weeds the waves leave on the shore after straining and tugging. She added an allusion to the crystal river of her tears. He was irritated by her persistence, but distressed at the shock Chujo's foolish jest had given her, and answered with the poem. "At the antics of the prancing wave you have good cause to be angry, but blameless indeed is the shore on whose sands it lashed." The belt proved to be Chujo's, That was clear, for it was darker than his own cloak. And as he examined his cloak, he noticed the lower half of one sleeve torn away. What a mess. He told himself with disgust that he was becoming a rowdy, a vulgar knight, brawler. Such people, he knew, always tore their clothes and made themselves ridiculous. It was time to reform. The missing sleeve soon arrived from Chujo's apartments with the message, "Had you not better have this sewn on before you wear your cloak?" How he had managed to obtain it annoyed him. Such tricks were both tiresome and silly. But he supposed he must now return the belt, and wrapping it in paper of matching hue, he sent it with a riddling poem, saying he would not keep it lest it cause trouble between Chujo and the lady. "You have dragged her away from me, as in the scuffle you snatched from me this belt," wrote Chujo in reply, adding, "Have I not good reason to be angry with you?" Later that morning, they met in the presence room. Genji wore a solemn, abstracted air. Chujo could not help recalling the absurd scene of their last meeting, but it was a day packed with public business, and he was absorbed in duty. Yet from time to time, each would catch sight of the other's serious face and official bearing, and be unable to refrain from smiling. In a pause, Chujo came up to Genji and asked in a low voice whether he had decided to be a little more communicative about his affairs. "No, indeed," said Genji, "but I feel I owe you an apology for preventing you from spending a happy hour with the lady you had come to see. Everything seems to go wrong." Thus they whispered, and at the end, each solemnly promised the other not to mention the matter to anyone. But to them, it furnished a constant source of jokes for a long time, though Genji took the affair more to heart than he showed, and resolved never to get mixed up with such a tiresome creature again. He heard, however, the lady remained much ruffled, and fearing no one might be at hand to comfort her, he lacked the heart quite to cease his visits. Chujo, faithful to his pledge, mentioned the affair to no one, not even his sister, but kept it as a weapon should Genji ever preach high morality to him again. The emperor's marked favor toward Genji made even the other princes of the blood royal somewhat in awe of him. But no Chujo was ready to dispute with him on any subject, and by no means inclined to yield always. He and Ai were the only children of the emperor's sister. Genji, it is true, was the emperor's son, but though Chujo's father was only a minister, his influence far exceeded that of his colleagues, and as the son of such a man with a royal princess for wife, he was accustomed to the greatest deference. It had never occurred to him that he was in any way Genji's inferior, for he knew as to his person at least he had no cause for complaint, and in most other qualities, character or intelligence, he thought himself well endowed. Thus a friendly rivalry sprang up between them, and led to many diverting incidents too numerous to relate. In the 7th month, 2 notable events occurred. An empress was appointed, and Genji was raised to the rank of counselor. The emperor intended soon to resign the throne. He would have liked to name his new-born child heir apparent in place of Kokaiden's son. This was difficult, for no political function would support such a choice. Fujitsubo's relations were all of imperial blood, and Genji, to whom he might have looked for aid because of his tie to the Minamoto clan, unfortunately showed no knack for political intrigue. The best he could do was at least to strengthen Fujitsubo's position and hope that later she might exert influence. Kokkaiden heard of his intentions and with good reason was distressed and astonished. The emperor tried to soothe her by pointing out that in a short time her son would succeed to the throne, and she would then hold the equivalent rank of Empress Mother. But it was indeed hard that the mother of the heir apparent should be passed over in favor of a concubine, barely more than 20. The public tended to side with Kokkaiden, and discontent was rife. On the night the new empress was installed, Genji, as a counselor, was among those who attended her to the Middle Palace. As daughter of a former empress and mother of an exquisite prince, she enjoyed a consideration at court beyond that her new title alone would procure. But if the other great lords of her train attended her with admiring devotion, it may be imagined with what fond yet anguished thoughts Prince Genji followed the litter wherein she rode. She seemed at last raised so far beyond his reach that, scarcely knowing what he did, he murmured to himself the lines, "Now upon love's dark path has the last shadow closed, for I have seen you carried to a cloud, land whither none may climb." As days and months passed, the child grew ever more like Genji. The new empress was greatly distressed, but no one else seemed to notice the resemblance. He was not, of course, as handsome. How should he have been? Yet both were beautiful, and the world was content to accept their beauty without troubling to compare them, just as it accepts both moon and sun as lovely occupants of the sky. Murasaki Shikibu, Genji Monogatari, The Tale of Genji Chapter 8, The Flower Feast. About the 20th day of the second month, the emperor gave a Chinese banquet beneath the great cherry tree of the southern court. Both Fujitsubo and the heir apparent were expected to attend. Kakaidan, though she felt sure that the empress's mere presence would mar her enjoyment, could not bring herself to omit so delightful an entertainment. After a threat of rain, the weather turned glorious. In full sunshine, with birds singing in every tree, the guests, royal princes, noblemen, and professional poets alike received the rhyme, words which the emperor had drawn by lot, and set themselves to compose their verses. It was with a clear, resonant voice that Genji announced the word, spring, as the rhyme sound allotted to his poem. Next came To no Chujo, who, conscious that all eyes were upon him and desirous of making a favorable impression, moved with the utmost elegance and grace. And when, on receiving his rhyme, he proclaimed his name, rank, and titles, he took especial pains to speak pleasantly as well as distinctly. Many of the other gentlemen looked rather nervous and rather pale as they advanced, yet they acquitted themselves fairly well. But the professional poets, especially because the emperor's and the heir apparent's keen interest in Chinese poetry had then raised the standard of accomplishment throughout the court, were very ill at ease. As they crossed the long stretch of garden to receive their rhymes, they felt utterly helpless. A simple Chinese verse is certainly not much to ask of a professional, yet they all wore an expression of the deepest gloom. One expects elderly scholars to be somewhat singular in their movements and behavior, and it was diverting to note the lively concern with which the emperor observed their various, always uncouth and erratic, approaches to the throne. Needless to say, a good deal of music had been prepared. Towards dusk, the charming dance known as the warbling of spring nightingales was given, and when it concluded, the heir apparent, recalling the festival of red leaves, placed a wreath upon Genji's head and urged him so insistently that refusal was out of the question. Rising, he very quietly executed a fragment of the sleeve, turning passage from the wave dance. In a few moments, he had resumed his seat, but even within that brief extract from a long dance, he contrived to infuse unrivaled charm and grace. Even his father-in-law, who was not in the best humor with him, was deeply moved and found himself brushing away a tear. "And why have we not seen To no Chujo?" asked the heir apparent. Whereupon Chujo performed the park of willow flowers, giving a far more complete display than Genji, for he no doubt anticipated being summoned and had taken pains to prepare his dance. It was a great triumph, and the emperor presented him with a cloak, which everyone agreed was an extraordinary honor. After this, the other young noblemen present danced in no particular order, but it had grown so dark that it was impossible to distinguish their performances. Then the poems were opened and read aloud. Genji's verses, when read, were repeatedly interrupted by loud murmurs of applause. Even the professional poets were profoundly impressed, and it is easy to imagine the pride with which the emperor, to whom Genji at times proved a source of solace and delight, watched him on such an occasion. Fujitsubo, when she allowed her glance to rest in his direction, marveled that even Kokiden could harbor hatred for him. "It is because he cares for me. There can be no other reason," she resolved at last, and the verse, "Were I but a common mortal who now am gazing at the beauty of this flower, from its sweet petals not long should I withhold the dew of love," rose to her lips, though she dared not utter it aloud. It was now very late, and the banquet was over. The guests had dispersed. The Empress and the heir apparent had both returned to the palace. All was still. The moon had climbed very bright and clear, and Genji, heated with wine, could not bear to leave so lovely a scene. The people at the palace were probably sunk in deep sleep. On such a night, it was not unlikely that some careless person might have left a door unfastened, some shutter unbarred. Cautiously and stealthily, he crept towards Fujitsubo's apartments and inspected them. Every bolt was drawn. He sighed. Here plainly was nothing to be done. He was passing the loggia of Kokiden's palace when he observed that the shutters of the third arch were not closed. After the banquet, Kokiden herself had gone straight to the emperor's rooms. No one seemed to be about. A door leading from the loggia into the house stood open, but he could hear no sound within. It is under just such circumstances as this that one is apt to drift into compromising situations, Genji thought. Nevertheless, he climbed quietly onto the balustrade and peeped. Everyone must be asleep. But no, a very pleasing young voice, with an intonation certainly not that of any waiting, woman or common person, was softly humming the last two lines of the Abarazuki, yo. Was not the voice coming nearer? It seemed so, and stretching out his hand, he suddenly found that he was grasping a lady's sleeve. "Oh, how you frighten me," she cried. "Who is it? Do not be alarmed," he whispered. That both of us were not content to miss the beauty of this departing night is proof clearer than the half-clouded moon that we were meant to meet. And as he spoke the lines, he took her gently by the hand and led her into the house, closing the door behind them. Her surprised and puzzled air fascinated him. "There is someone there," she whispered, trembling, and pointed to the inner room. "Child," he answered, "I am free to go where I please, and if you summon your friends, they will only tell you that I have every right to be here. But if you will remain quietly here," it was Genji. She knew his voice, and the discovery reassured her somewhat. She judged his conduct odd, yet she resolved not to appear prudish or stiff. And so, because he on his part was still heated by the evening's doings, while she was too young and supple to offer serious resistance, he soon had his way with her. Suddenly they perceived, to their discomfiture, that dawn was stealing into the sky. She looked, Genji thought, as though many disturbing reflections crowded upon her mind. "Tell me your name," he said. "How can I write to you unless you do? Surely this will not be our only meeting." She answered with a poem in which she declared that names belong only to this world, and that he would not wish to know hers if he meant their love to endure for other worlds to come. It was mere wit, and Genji, amused by her quickness, replied, "You are quite right. It was a mistake on my part to ask." And he recited the poem, "While still I seek to find on which blade dwells the dew, a great wind shakes the grasses of the level land. If you did not repent this meeting," he continued, "you would surely tell me who you are. I do not think that you wish." But here they were interrupted by the sound of people stirring in the next room. There was a great bustle, and it became plain that they would soon set out to fetch Princess Kokiden back from the palace. There remained just time to exchange fans, as tokens of their new friendship before Genji was compelled to flee precipitately from the room. In his own apartments, he found many of his gentlemen awaiting him. Some were awake, and these nudged one another when he entered as though to say, "Will he never cease these disreputable excursions?" But caution forbade them from showing they had seen him, and they all pretended to be fast asleep. Genji also lay down, but he could not rest. He strove to recall the features of the lady, with whom he had just spent so agreeable an hour. Certainly, she must be one of Kokaiden's sisters. Perhaps the fifth or sixth daughter, both still unmarried. The handsomest among them, or so he had always heard, were Prince Sochi's wife and the fourth daughter, the one on bad terms with To no Chujo. It would be rather diverting if it turned out to be Chujo's wife. The sixth was shortly to be married to the heir apparent. How tiresome if it were she. But at present, he could think of no way to be certain. She had not acted as if she did not wish to see him again. Why then had she refused to give him any means of communicating with her? In truth, he worried so much and turned the matter over with such ceaseless persistence that it soon became evident he had fallen deeply in love with her. Yet no sooner did the recollection of Fujitsubo's grave and reserved demeanor return to his mind than he perceived how incomparably more she meant to him than this light-hearted lady. That day the after banquet occupied him till late at night. At the emperor's command, he performed on the 13-stringed zithern and achieved even greater success than with his dancing the day before. At dawn, Fujitsubo withdrew to the emperor's rooms. Disappointed that the lady of last night did not in some way make an appearance, he sent for Yashikio and Kormitsu, with whom all his secrets were shared, and instructed them to keep watch upon the lady's household. When he returned the next day from duty at the palace, they reported that they had just seen several coaches depart, which had been drawn up under shelter in the courtyard of the watch. Among a group of persons who seemed to be the domestic attendants of those for whom the coaches were waiting, two gentlemen threaded their way in great haste. These we recognized as Shiai no Shosho and Uchubin, so there is little doubt the carriages belonged to Princess Kokkaiden. For the rest, we noted that the ladies were by no means ill, looking, and that the whole party drove away in 3 carriages, they said. Genji's heart beat quickly, but he was no nearer than before to discovering which of the sisters it had been. Suppose her father, the minister of the right, should hear anything of this, what an uproar there would be. It would indeed mean his absolute ruin. It was a pity that, while he was at it, he had not stayed with her until it was a little lighter. But there it was. He did not know her face, yet he was resolved to recognize her. How? He lay on his bed devising and rejecting endless schemes. Murasaki, too, must be growing impatient. Days had passed since he had visited her, and he remembered with tenderness how low-spirited she became when he was absent. But in a moment, his thoughts returned to the unknown lady. He still possessed her fan. It was a folding fan with ribs of hinoki, wood and tassels tied in a splice knot. One side was covered with silver leaf, on which a dim moon was painted, giving the effect of the moon reflected in water. It was a motif he had seen many times before, but it had pleasant associations for him, and continuing the metaphor of the grass on the moor, which she had used in her poem he wrote upon the fan, has mortal man ever puzzled his head with such a question before as to ask where the moon goes to when she leaves the sky at dawn? Then he put the fan carefully away. He felt guilty that he had not for some time gone to the great hall, but fearing that Murasaki too might be feeling very unhappy, he first went home to give her her lessons. Every day she was improving, not only in looks, but in amiability of character. The beauty of her disposition was indeed exceptional. The thought that so perfect a nature was in his hands to train and cultivate, as he thought fit, was very attractive to Genji. It might, however, be objected that to receive all her instruction from a young man is likely to make a girl somewhat forward in manner. First, there was much to tell her of the court entertainments of the last few days. Then followed her music lesson, and already it was time to go. Oh, why must he always go away so soon? She wondered sadly, though by now she was so accustomed to it that she no longer fretted as she had done a little while before. At the great hall he could, as usual, scarcely get a word from Ai. The moment he sat idle, 1,000 doubts and puzzles began to revolve in his mind. He took up his zithern and began to sing. No softer pillowed is my head that rests by thine unloving bride than were those jagged stones my bed through which the falls of Nuki stride. At that moment, Ai's father came by and began to remark upon the unusual success of the recent festivities. Old as I am, he said, and I may say, I have lived to see 4 illustrious sovereigns occupy the throne. I have never taken part in a banquet producing verses so spirited or dancing and music so admirably performed. Talent of every description seems at present to exist in abundance, but it is creditable to those in authority that they knew how to make good use of it. For my part, I enjoyed myself so much that had I but been a few years younger, I would positively have joined in the dancing. No special steps were taken to discover the musicians, Genji answered. We merely used those known to the government here and there as capable performers. If I may say so, it was Chujo's willow dance that made the deepest impression and is likely always to be remembered as a remarkable performance. But if you, sir, had indeed honored us, a new luster would have been added to my father's reign. Ai's brothers now arrived, and leaning against the balustrade, gave a little concert, their various instruments blending delightfully. Fugitive though their meeting had been, it had sufficed to plunge the lady whose identity Prince Genji was now intent on establishing into the depths of despair. For in the 4th month, she was to become the heir apparent's wife. Turmoil filled her mind. Why had Genji not visited her again? He must surely know whose daughter she was. But how should he know which daughter? Moreover, Kokaiden's house was not a place where, except under very strange circumstances, he would be likely to feel at ease. And so she waited in great impatience and distress, but of Genji there was no news. About the 20th day of the 3rd month, her father, the minister of the right, arranged an archery meeting at which most of the young noblemen and princes were present. It was followed by a wisteria feast. The cherry blossom had for the most part fallen, but 2 trees, which the minister seemed somehow to have persuaded to flower later than all the rest, were still an enchanting sight. He had had his house rebuilt only a short time before when celebrating the initiation of his granddaughters, the children of Kokkaiden. It was now a magnificent residence, and nothing in it, but was of the very latest fashion. He had invited Genji when they had met at the palace only a few days earlier, and was extremely annoyed when he did not appear. Feeling that his party would fail if Genji were absent, he sent his son Shei no Shosho to fetch him, with the poem, "Were my flowers as those of other gardens, never should I have ventured to summon you." Genji was in attendance upon the emperor, and at once showed him the message. "He seems very pleased with himself and his flowers," His Majesty said with a smile, adding, "As he has sent for you like this, I think you had better go. After all, your half-sisters are being brought up at his house, and you ought not to treat him quite as a stranger." He went to his apartments and dressed. It was very late indeed, when at last he made his appearance at the party. He wore a cloak of thin Chinese fabric, white outside, but lined with yellow. His robe was of a deep wine, red hue with a very long train. The dignity and grace with which he carried this fancifully regal attire in a company where all were dressed in plain, official robes were remarkable. And in the end, his presence perhaps added more to the success of the party than did the fragrance of the minister's vaunted flowers. His entrance was followed by some very agreeable music. It was already fairly late when Genji, alleging that the wine had given him a headache, left his seat and strolled away. He knew that his two step-sisters, Kokkaiden's daughters, were in the inner apartments. He went to the eastern portico and rested there. It was on that side of the house that the wisteria grew. The wooden blinds were raised, and a number of ladies leaned from the window to enjoy the blossoms. They had draped bright, colored robes and shawls over the window, still just as is done at New Year dancing and other gala days, and their freedom of allure contrasted oddly with the sober decorum of Fujitsubo's household. "I am feeling rather overpowered by all the noise and bustle of the flower party," Genji explained. "I am very sorry to disturb my sisters, but I can think of nowhere else to seek shelter." And advancing towards the main door of the women's apartments, he pushed back the curtain with his shoulder. "Refuge indeed," cried one of the ladies, laughing at him. "You ought to know by now that it is only poor relations who come to take refuge with the more successful members of their family. What, pray, have you come to bother us for? Impertinent creatures," he thought, but nevertheless there was something in their manner which convinced him they were persons of some consequence in the house, and not, as he had first supposed, mere waiting women. A scent of costly perfumes pervaded the room. Silken skirts rustled in the darkness. There could be little doubt that these were Cockeyed's sisters and their friends. Deeply absorbed, as indeed was the whole family, in the fashionable gaieties of the moment, they had flouted decorum and stationed themselves at the window that they might see as much as they could of the banquet proceeding outside. Little dreaming that his plan might succeed, yet urged on by delightful recollections of his previous encounter, he advanced towards them, chanting in a careless undertone the song, "At Ishikawa, Ishikawa, a man from coma took my belt away." But for belt, he substituted fan, and by this device he sought to discover which of the ladies was his companion. "Why, you have got it wrong. I never heard of that Korean," one of them cried. Certainly it was not she. But there was another who, though she remained silent, seemed to him to be sighing softly to herself. He stole towards the curtain of state behind which she sat, and taking her hand in his at a venture, he whispered the poem. "If on this day of shooting my arrow went astray, 'twas that in dim morning twilight only the mark had glimmered in my view." And she, no longer able to conceal that she knew him, answered with the verse, "Had it been with the arrows of the heart that you had shot, though from the moon's slim bow no brightness came, would you have missed your mark?" Yes, it was her voice. He was delighted, and yet... Murasaki Shikibu, Genji Monogatari, The Tale of Genji Chapter 9, AOI. The new emperor's accession proved in many respects disadvantageous to Genji's standing. His recent promotion likewise brought weighty obligations, which unhappily interrupted the progress of his secret attachments, so that reproaches of abandonment or neglect were shortly leveled against him from several quarters. And, as if fortune were determined to punish him, the very woman whose love he had vainly coveted had now entirely withdrawn from him. Now that the sovereign was at liberty to live as he pleased, she was more constantly than before at his side, and no rival any longer disturbed her tranquility, for Cockeyed, resentful of the late emperor's indifference, now seldom quitted her son's palace. A continual round of banquets and entertainments, the splendor of which became the talk of the whole realm, enlivened the ex-emperor's retirement and left him on the whole well contented. His sole anxiety concerned the heir apparent whose position, unbacked by any strong outside influence, he considered precarious. He was forever discussing the matter with Genji, urging him to secure the countenance of the Minamoto clan. Such conversations were somewhat awkward, yet they pleased Genji inasmuch as they enabled him to take steps for the boy's welfare. An unexpected incident occurred. Lady Rokujo's daughter by her late husband Prince Zembo was selected as the new Vestal Virgin at Ise. Her mother, who at the moment when the appointment was first announced happened to be particularly resentful of Genji's conduct towards her, immediately resolved to make her child's extreme youth a plea for quitting the capital and settling permanently at Ise. Being at the time, as I have said, in a very bad humor, she spoke of her intentions openly, disclosing the real motives that made her wish to leave the city. The story soon reached the ex-emperor, and sending for Genji, he said to him, "The late prince, my brother, was, as you doubtless know, regarded with profound affection and esteem, and I am deeply grieved that your reckless and heedless behavior should have cast a stigma upon his house. For his daughter, indeed, I feel as much responsible as if she were one of my own children. I must require you henceforth to spare no pains in guarding the reputation of these unfortunate ladies. If you do not learn to restrain your wanton inclinations, you will, before long, find yourself most unpopular. Why should his father be so excessively concerned over the matter? And Genji, smarting from the reproof, was about to defend himself when it struck him that the warning was not wholly undeserved, and he remained respectfully silent. Affairs of this sort, the ex-emperor went on, must be conducted in such a manner that the woman, whoever she may be, need not feel herself humiliated or treated with coarse indifference. Neglect this rule, and she will soon make you feel the unpleasant consequences of her resentment. Wicked as he already deems me, thought Genji, while this admonition continued, there is a far darker enormity of which he knows nothing. Stunned with terror at the thought of what would follow if his father ever discovered that hideous secret, he bowed and withdrew. What the ex-emperor had said about ruining others, reputations wounded him to the quick. He recognized that Rokujo's rank and widowhood entitled her to the utmost consideration. Yet after all, it was not he who had made the affair public. On the contrary, he had done everything in his power to keep it concealed. There had always been a certain patronizing tone in her manner toward him, arising perhaps from the disparity of their years, and his estrangement from her was solely due to the cold reception she had long accorded him. That their private relations were now known, not only to the ex-emperor but presumably to the whole court, showed a want of reticence which he deplored. Among those who heard of the episode was Princess Asago. Determined that she at least would not submit to such treatment, she ceased to answer his letters even with the brief guarded replies she had formerly been wont to send. Nevertheless, he found it hard to credit that so mild-mannered a creature could think ill of him, and continued to regard her with devoted admiration. Princess Ai, when the story reached her ears, was naturally distressed by this fresh evidence of his inconstancy. Yet she felt that it was futile, now that his infidelity was open and unashamed, to make a protest over any single affront, and to his surprise seemed to take the matter with less keenness. She was suffering much inconvenience from her condition, and her spirits were very low. Her parents received the news with mixed delight and apprehension. But their rejoicing, and that of all her friends, was clouded by grave forebodings, and they arranged that prayers for her health and special intercessions should be recited in all the temples. At such a crisis, Genji could not leave her, and there were many who, though their own feelings for him had not cooled, fancied themselves neglected. The Vestal Virgin of Kamo yet remained to be chosen. The selection fell upon Kakaiden's daughter, San no Miya. She was greatly beloved by both her brother, the new emperor, and by the empress mother. Her retirement from the world was a bitter blow to them, but nothing could be done, since she alone of the royal princesses satisfied the required conditions. The form of investiture could not be altered, but the emperor took care that the ceremonies should be conducted with the utmost pomp and splendor. And to the time-honored rites of the Kamo festival, he added so many embellishments that it became a spectacle of unparalleled magnificence. All this sprang from his partiality for the virgin-elect. On the day of her purification, the virgin is escorted by a prescribed number of noblemen and princes. For this retinue, the emperor was careful to choose the best, formed and most handsome young men at court. He determined the colors of their gowns, the pattern upon their breeches, and even the saddles they should ride. By special edict, he directed that Prince Genji should be one of this retinue, and such was the public eagerness to obtain a view of the procession that long beforehand people prepared special carriages to line the route. The scene along the main highway of the First Ward was one of indescribable excitement. Dense throngs surged within the narrow space allotted to them, while the stands, constructed with ingenious fancy all along the procession's course, and hung with gay cloaks and shawls over their balustrades, were in themselves a spectacle of astonishing beauty. Ai had never been wont to attend such occasions, and in her present state of health, she would not have dreamed of doing so had not her gentlewomen clustered round and urged, "Come, madam. It will be no fun for us to go alone and be hidden in some corner. People have come today to see Prince Genji. Why, all sorts of odd mountain folk are here, and people have brought their wives and children from provinces far away. If all these people who are nothing to do with him have taken the trouble to come so far, it will be too bad if you, his own lady, are not present." Hearing this, Ai's mother joined in. "You are feeling somewhat better just now," she said. "I think you ought to make the effort. It will be such a disappointment for your gentlewomen." At the last moment, Ai changed her mind and decided to go. It was now so late that there was no time to don gala attire. The whole enclosure reserved for this purpose was already lined with carriages packed so close that it was impossible to find space for the numerous vehicles of Ai and her train. Several grand ladies began to make room for her, backing their coaches away to leave a suitable place in the reserved enclosure. Prominent among them were two work carriages of an old-fashioned pattern but curtained like those used by persons of quality, discreetly adorned with draperies that showed only slightly beneath the curtains. Yet these trappings, whether sleeve, favor, skirt, or scarf, were all of the handsomest hues. They seemed to belong to some exalted personage who wished to remain unknown. When it was their turn to move, the coachmen in charge refused to lift a finger. "It is not for such as we to make way," they said stiffly, and did not stir. Among the attendants on both sides were several young grooms already the worse for drink. They longed for a brawl and could not be kept in order. The sedate elder outriders tried to call them back, but they paid no heed. Those two carriages belonged to Princess Rokujo, who had come secretly to the festival, hoping for a moment's distraction from her troubles. Despite the precautions she had taken to hide her identity, some of Ai's gentlemen at once suspected her, and cried to the grooms that this was not an equipage to be treated so high-handedly, or else it would be said that their lady was abusing her position as wife of the Lord Commander. But at that instant, several of Genji's servants crowded into the fray. They recognized Rokujo's men by sight, yet after a moment's confusion, they chose not to assist the enemy by betraying her identity. Thus reinforced, Ai's faction prevailed, and at length her coach and those of all her ladies were drawn up on the front row, while Rokujo's was shoved back among a miscellaneous collection of carts and gigs where she could see nothing at all. She was vexed beyond measure, not only at missing what she had come to witness, but at being recognized despite all her precautions and, as she was convinced, deliberately insulted. Parts of her coach, such as the shaft, rest were damaged, and she was obliged to prop it against a common person's carriage wheels. Why, she vainly asked herself, had she come among these hateful crowds? She would go home at once. What sense was there in waiting for the procession? But when she tried to depart, she found it impossible to force a way through the dense masses. She was still struggling to escape when the cry arose that the procession was in sight. Her resolution faltered. She would wait till Genji had passed. He did not see her. How should he? For the throngs flashed by him like the fleeting images a stream catches and breaks. She perceived this, yet her disappointment was none the less. The carriages that lined the route, decked and garlanded for this great day, were crammed to overflowing with excited ladies who, though there was scarcely room for them, refused to be left behind. Peering out from under the blinds of their coaches, they smiled at the great personages passing without much regard to whether their greetings were acknowledged. Yet every now and then a smile would be met by a quick glance or the backward turn of a head. Ai's party was large and conspicuous. He wheeled around as he went by and saluted its members with attentive courtesy. Rider after rider, as the procession passed, would pause before Ai's coach and salute her with profound respect. The humiliation of witnessing all this from an obscure corner was more than Rokujo could endure, and murmuring the lines, "Though I saw him, but as a shadow that falls on hurrying waters, yet knew I that at last my hour of utmost misery was come," she broke into tears. It was dreadful that her attendants should behold her in such a state. Yet even as she struggled with her weeping, she could not bring herself to regret having in some fashion seen him in all his splendor. The riders in the procession were indeed all splendidly arrayed, each in accordance with his rank, and the young noblemen picked by the emperor made such a brilliant display that only the radiance of Genji's beauty could have outshone their splendor. The commander of this bodyguard is not normally provided with a palace officer as special attendant, but as the occasion was so weighty, the imperial treasurer rode at Genji's side. It appeared to those who witnessed so many public honors conferred upon him that no bud of fortune could resist the favoring gale that blew his way. Among the throng were women of good birth who had put on walking skirts and come a long distance on foot. There were nuns and other recluse women who, though to see any part of the procession they were forced to be repeatedly jostled, and though they commonly regarded such spectacles with disdain, declared to day that they would not have missed it for anything. Old men grinned through toothless gums, strange girls with hair tucked under ragged hoods, and stolid peasant boys stood with hands uplifted as though in prayer. Their uncouth faces were suddenly transfigured with wonder and joy as the procession burst into sight. Even the daughters of remote provincial magistrates and governors, who had no acquaintances in the city, had expended as much coquetry upon the decoration of their persons and coaches as if going to a lover's inspection, and their equipages contributed a bright and varied note. If even these strangers were so carried away, one may imagine with what emotion, sprinkled here and there among the crowd, those with whom Genji was in secret communication watched the procession, and how many hidden sighs stirred their breasts. Prince Mamazono had a place in one of the stands. He marveled to see his nephew grown into so prodigiously handsome a youth, and feared lest soon the gods should cast an envious eye upon him. Princess Asago could not but be touched by the rare persistence with which year after year Genji had pursued her. Even had he been positively ugly, she would have found it hard to resist such importunity. So small wonder if, seeing him ride by in all his grace, she wondered that she had resisted so long. Yet she resolved to know him better before committing herself. The young waiting, women with her were lavish in their praises of him. Ai herself did not attend the festival. News of the fray between her servants and Rokujo's soon reached Genji. It vexed him intensely that such a thing should have happened. That the exquisitely well-bred Ai should in any measure be responsible for this outbreak of insolent ruffianism, he could not for a moment believe. It must be the work of rough retainers who, though given no express orders, had imbibed the notion that matters were ill between the two houses, and fancied they would gain credit by espousing their mistress's cause. He knew well the unusual vanity and sensitiveness of the affronted lady. Distressed at the torment this incident must have inflicted upon her, he hurried to her house. But her daughter, the virgin-elect of Issei, was still there, and this provided grounds for turning him away after exchanging a few formal words. He had the deepest sympathy for her, yet he was weary of coping with injured susceptibilities. He could not bring himself to go straight back to the Great Hall. It was the day of the Kamo festival, and, going to his own palace, he ordered Koremitsu to have his coach ready. "Look at her," he cried, smiling fondly at Murasaki when she appeared in all her finery surrounded by the little children he had given her for playmates. "She must needs bring her dames to wait upon her," and stroking the beautiful hair which to-day Shanagan had dressed with greater care than usual. "It is growing rather long," he said, Today would not be a bad time for a cut, and sending for his astrologer, he bade him consult his books. "The maids of honor first," he cried, nodding at the pretty troop of babes, and their dainty locks were trimmed to hang neatly over their diapered holiday gowns. "I am going to cut yours myself," he told Murasaki. "What a mass of it there is. I wonder how much longer it would have grown. Truly, it was hard work. Those with very long hair ought to wear it cut rather short over the temples," he remarked at last. "But I have not the heart to crop you any closer," and he laid down the knife. Shanagan's delight knew no bounds when he finished the prayer that should conclude the hair-cutting ceremony. There is a sea weed called muru used in the dressing of ladies' hair and playing upon this word, which also means to see. He recited a poem in which he said that the muru, weed used in the washing of her hair, was a token that he would forever lovingly watch it grow. She answered that, like the tides which visit the muru in its cleft, he came and went, and often her tresses, unwatched by him, would, like the hidden sea weed, grow. She wrote this prettily on a slip of paper, and though the verse had no merit beyond the charm of a child's mind, it gave him great pleasure. Today the crowds were as thick as ever. With difficulty, he managed to wedge his carriage close to the royal stables. But here they were surrounded by somewhat turbulent young noblemen, and he was looking for a quieter spot when a smart carriage crammed with ladies halted nearby, and someone in it beckoned, with a fan, to Genji's attendants. "Will you not come over where we are?" said one of the ladies. "We will gladly make room for you." Such an offer was perhaps somewhat forward, but the place she indicated was so good that Genji at once accepted the invitation. "I am afraid it is very unfair that we should take your place like this," Genji was beginning to say politely, when one of the ladies handed him a fan with its corner bent down. There he found the poem. "This flower, decked day of meeting when the great God unfolds his portents, in vain have I waited, for alas another is at thy side." Surely the handwriting was familiar. Yes, it was that of the ancient lady of the bedchamber. He felt it was time she should abandon such pranks, and answered dissuasively, "Not ours this day of tryst, when garlanded and passionate the 80 tribes converge." This put the lady out of countenance, and she replied, "Now bitterly do I repent that for this cheating day my head is decked with flowers, for in name only is it a day of meeting." Their carriages remained side by side, yet Genji did not even draw up the side curtains, which disappointed many. The splendor of his recent public appearance was contrasted by all with the unobtrusive manner in which he now mingled with the crowd. It was generally agreed that his companion, whoever she might be, must surely be some very great lady. Genji feared his neighbor might prove troublesome. Fortunately, some of her companions showed more discretion than their mistress, and out of consideration for the unknown sharer of Genji's coach, prevailed upon the voluble lady to hold her tongue. Lady Rokujo's sufferings were now far worse than in former years. Though she could no longer endure to be treated as Genji was treating her, the thought of separating wholly from him and going so far away upset her so much that she continually postponed her journey. She felt also that she would be made a laughingstock if it were thought she had fled because of Genji's scorn. Yet if at the last moment she changed her plans and remained, everyone would call her conduct erratic and inexplicable. Thus her days and nights were a torment of indecision, and she often repeated to herself the lines, "My heart, like the fishers, float on east shore, is danced from wave to wave." She felt indeed tossed this way, and that by paroxysms that sickened her but were utterly beyond her control. Genji, though it grieved him that she should feel compelled to go so far, did not attempt to dissuade her from the journey. "It is quite natural," he wrote, "that tiresome creature as I am you should wish to cast me wholly from your mind. I only beg that even though you see no use in it, you will let me see you once more before you go. Were we to meet, you would soon find that I care for your happiness far more than you suppose." But she could not forget how, when at the river of cleansing, she had sought a respite from the torture of her own doubt and indecision. Rough waves had dashed her against the rocks, and she brooded upon this injury till it filled her heart to exclusion of other thought. Meanwhile, Princess Ai became strangely distraught, and it seemed at times as though a hostile spirit had entered her. The entire household was plunged into such anxiety and gloom that Genji could not bear to be absent for more than a few hours. It was only very occasionally that he reached his own palace. After all, she was his wife. Moreover, despite the difficulties between them, he cared for her very deeply. He could no longer conceal from himself that besides the discomfort naturally attendant on her condition, there was something else amiss with her, and he was in great distress. Continuous rituals of exorcism and divination were performed at his direction, and the consensus was that all the signs pointed to possession by the spirit of some living person. Many names were tried, but to none did the spirit answer, and it seemed impossible to dislodge it. Ai herself felt that some alien thing had entered her, and though she was not conscious of any definite pain or terror, the sense of its presence never left her. The most renowned healers of the day were powerless to expel it, and it became apparent that this was no ordinary case of possession. Some great accumulation of malice was discharging itself upon her. It was natural that her friends should turn over in their minds the names of those whom Genji had most favored. It was whispered that only with Lady Rokujo and the girl at the Nijo Inn had he been on terms of intimacy such as might breed jealousy strong enough to be lethal. But when the doctors tried to conjure the spirit by uttering these names, there was no visible response. She had in the world no enemy who might be practicing deliberate witchcraft against her. Such ailments were sometimes ascribed to the spirit of a dead retainer or an old household nurse, or again the malice of someone whom the minister, Ai's father, had angered might, owing to her delicate state, have fastened upon her instead of upon him. Conjecture after conjecture was advanced and then refuted. Meanwhile, she lay endlessly weeping. Constantly, indeed, she would break into sobbing fits so violent that she was breathless, while those about her, in sore alarm for her safety, stood in misery not knowing what to do. The ex-emperor inquired after her ceaselessly. He even commanded special services to be said on her behalf, and these attentions served to remind her parents of how highly she was thought of at court. Not among her friends only, but throughout the land, the news of her illness caused widespread distress. Rokujo heard of her suffering with deep concern. For years, they had openly vied for Genji's favors, but even after that wretched episode of the coaches, which had indeed enraged her, she had never gone so far as to desire ill against the princess. She herself was very unwell. She began to fear that the violent and distracting emotions which perpetually assailed her had in some subtle manner unhinged her mind, and she resolved to seek spiritual aid at a place several miles from her home. Genji learned of this and, much concerned for her, at once set out for the house where she was reported to be staying. It lay beyond the city precincts, and he had to go with the greatest secrecy. He begged her pardon for not having visited sooner. "I have not been having a cheerful time," he said, and gave her some account of Ai's condition. He wished to make her feel that if he had stayed away, it was from melancholy necessity, and not because he had found more amusing company elsewhere. "It is not so much my own anxiety that unnerves me as the spectacle of the appalling helplessness and misery into which her illness has plunged her wretched parents, and it was in the hope of forgetting for a while these sick-room horrors that I came to see you today. If only once you could overlook all my offenses and take pity upon me." His entreaty had no effect. Her manner was colder than before. He was not angry with her, nor indeed surprised. Day was already breaking when, unaided, he set out for home. Yet as she watched him depart, his beauty suddenly swept away all her resolutions, and again she felt it madness to leave him. But what had she to stay for? Ai was with child, and that could only mean he had at least so far made his peace. Henceforth he might lead a life of blameless rectitude, and if now and again he came to make excuses, as he had today, what purpose would that serve save to keep alive the torment of her desire? At the close of her letter, she recalled the old song, "Now bitterly do I repent that ever I brought my pitcher to the mountain well where waters were but deep enough to soil my sleeve." He regarded the delicate handwriting. Who, even among women of such high lineage and breeding, could match the ineffable grace and elegance of such minute penmanship? That one whose mind and person so strongly attracted him should now by his own act be lost to him forever was a bitter thought. Though it was almost dark, he sat down and wrote to her, "Do not say that the waters have but wetted your sleeve. For the shallowness is in your comparison only, not in my affections." To this he added the poem, "'Tis you only who have loitered among the shallow pools, while I till all my limbs were drenched have battled through the thickets of love's dark track." And he concluded, "Had but a ray of comfort lighted the troubles of this house, I should myself have been the bearer of this note." Meanwhile, Ai's possession returned with full force. She was in pitiable torment. It reached Lady Rokujo that some attributed the illness to the operation of her living spirit. Others, she was told, believed that her father's ghost was avenging his daughter's wrongs. She brooded unceasingly over the nature of her feelings towards Ai, but could discover in herself nothing but intense unhappiness. Of malice toward Ai she could find no trace. Yet she could not be sure whether, in the depths of a soul consumed by anguish, some spark of malice had not lurked. Throughout the long years during which she had loved and suffered, though it had often seemed that no greater torment could exist, her whole being had never been so utterly bruised and shattered as in these recent days. It had begun with that hateful episode of the coaches. She had been scorned, treated as if she had no right to exist. Yes, it was true that since the festival of purification her mind had been buffeted by such a storm of conflicting resolves that at times it seemed she had lost all command of her thoughts. She recalled one night when, amid agonizing doubt and indecision, she found she had been dreaming. It seemed she was in a large, magnificent room where lay a girl she knew to be Princess Ai. Seizing her arm, she had dragged and mauled the prostrate figure, with an outburst of brutal fury wholly alien to her waking self. Since then, the same dream had recurred several times. How terrible. It seemed then that it was indeed possible for one's spirit to leave the body and execute emotions the waking mind would not countenance. Even where a person's deeds are almost beyond reproach, she reflected, people delight maliciously in saying nothing of the good he has done and everything of the evil. With what joy would they seize upon so monstrous a story as this? That after his death, a man's ghost should pursue his enemies is taken as a sign that the dead man was fiendishly malignant and his reputation utterly destroyed. What then will become of me if it is thought that while still alive I have committed so hideous a crime? She must face her fate. She had lost Genji forever. If she were to keep any control over her thoughts, she must first find some way to put him wholly from her mind. She kept telling herself not to think of him, so that this very resolve drove her to think of him the more. The Virgin of Ys should rightly have entered upon her duties before the year's end, but various difficulties arose, and it was not until the autumn of the following year that she could at last be received. She was to enter the palace, in the fields in the 9th month, but this was settled so late that arrangements for her second purification had to be made in haste. It was most inconvenient that at this juncture her mother, far from superintending the preparations, spent hour after hour lying dazed and helpless upon her bed. At last the priests came to fetch the girl away. They took a grave view of the mother's condition and gave her the benefit of their presence by offering many prayers and incantations. Yet week after week, she remained in the same state, showing no symptom that seemed actually dangerous, and yet all the while, in some vague and indefinable way, manifestly very ill. Genji sent continual inquiries, but she saw plainly that his attention was fixed elsewhere. AI's delivery was not yet due, and no preparations had been made, when suddenly signs indicated it was near. She was in great distress, but though healers chanted prayer after prayer, their utmost efforts could not shift the spiteful power possessing her by so much as a hair's breadth. All the greatest miracle workers of the land were present. The complete failure of their ministrations irritated and perplexed them. At last, daunted by the potency of their incantations, the spirit that possessed her found a voice and, weeping bitterly, was heard to say, "Give me a little respite. There is a matter of which Prince Genji and I must speak." The healers exchanged glances as though to say, "Now we shall learn something worth knowing." For they were convinced the possession was speaking through the mouth of the possessed, and they hurried Genji to her bedside. Her parents, thinking that her end was near, and she desired to give some last secret injunction to Genji, withdrew to the rear of the room. The priests too ceased their incantations, and began to recite the Hakakayo in low, impressive tones. He drew aside the bed curtain. She lay lovely as ever, very full with child, and any man who saw her even now would have found himself strangely moved by her beauty. How much more then Prince Genji, whose heart overflowed with tenderness and remorse. The plaited tresses of her long hair contrasted sharply with her white jacket. Even in that loose, sick, room garb her natural grace gave the air of a fashionable gown. He took her hand. "It is terrible," he began, "to see you looking so unhappy," and could speak no more. Still she gazed at him, but through his tears he saw there was no longer the wounded scorn he had so often known, but a look of forbearance and tender concern. And while she watched him weep, her own eyes brimmed with tears. He must not go on crying like this. Her parents would be alarmed. Besides, it upset Aoi herself, and meaning to cheer her, he said, "Come, things are not so bad as that. You will soon be much better. But even if anything should happen, it is certain that we shall meet again in another life. Your father and mother too, and many others, love you so dearly that between your fate and theirs, there must be some sure bond that will bring you back to them in many, many lives to be." Suddenly she interrupted him. "No, no. That is not it. But stop these prayers a while. They do me great harm." And drawing him nearer, she went on, "I did not think you would come. I have waited for you till my soul is burnt with longing." She spoke wistfully and tenderly, and still in that tone recited the verse, "Bind thou, as the seam of a skirt is braided, this shred, that from my soul despair and loneliness have sundered." The voice was not Ai's, nor was the manner hers. He knew someone whose voice resembled it. Who was it? Why, yes, surely only Shilady Rokujo. Once or twice he had heard suggestions that something of this sort might be occurring, but he had always rejected the idea as monstrous and unthinkable, believing it the malicious invention of scandal mongers, and had even denied that such possession ever took place. Now he had beheld one with his own eyes. Ghastly and incredible as they were, such things did occur. Controlling himself at last, he said in a low voice, "I am not sure who is speaking to me. Do not leave me in doubt." Her answer proved only too conclusively that he had guessed right. To his horror, her parents now returned to the bed, but she had ceased to speak, and seeing her lying quietly, her mother thought the attack over and, coming towards the bed with a basin of hot water, Ai suddenly started up and bore a child. For the moment all was joy and rejoicing, but it seemed likely that the spirit which had possessed her had been only temporarily dislodged, for a violent fit of terror soon seized her, as though the thing, whatever it was, were angry at having been put to the trouble of shifting, leaving grave anxiety about the future. The abbot of Tendai and the other great ecclesiastics present attributed the easy delivery to the perseverance of their own prayers and incantations, and as they hurried away to refresh themselves, they wiped their brows with an air of considerable self-satisfaction. Her friends, whose spirits had been in the deepest gloom for days, now took heart a little, believing that though there was no clear improvement, yet that with the child safely born she could not fail to mend. Prayers and incantations resumed, but through the house there was a fresh sense of confidence, for the diversion of looking after the baby at least gave them respite from the strain under which they had been living for so many days. Honored presents arrived from the ex-emperor, the royal princes, and all the court, forming an array that grew more dazzling by night. The fact that the child was a boy made the festivities surrounding his birth all the more sumptuous. The news of this event startled Lady Rokujo. The last account she had from the Great Hall declared the confinement would be extremely dangerous. And now they said there had been no difficulty at all. She found this very odd. For some time she herself had been suffering the most unsettling sensations. Often she felt as though her whole personality had somehow altered. Lately, she had noticed a smell of mustard seed incense about her clothes and hair for which she could not account. She bathed in hot water and changed her garments, yet still the same scent pursued her. It was bad enough, even in private, to feel estranged from oneself. But now her body was playing tricks, which her attendants must have observed, and were no doubt discussing behind her back. Yet there was no one among those about her with whom she could bring herself to discuss such things, and all this pent-up misery seemed only to hasten the strange process of dissolution beginning to prey upon her mind. Now that Genji was somewhat less anxious about Ai's state, the memory of his extraordinary conversation with her at the crisis of her attack kept recurring and made so painful an impression that, though he had not written to Rokujo for some time, and knew she must be deeply offended, he felt that no real intimacy with her could again be possible. Yet pity prevailed, and he sent her a letter. It seemed indeed heartless to absent himself entirely from one who had but lately passed through days of such terrible suffering, and from friends still in grave anxiety, and all his secret excursions were abandoned. Ai yet lay in a condition so serious that he was not permitted to see her. The child was the most handsome infant one could wish to see. The keen interest Genji took in him and the zest with which he entered into all arrangements for his welfare pleased Ai's father, as signs of a better understanding between his daughter and her husband. And though her slow recovery caused much anxiety, he considered that an illness of that severity must inevitably leave considerable traces, and persuaded himself her condition was less dangerous than might have been thought. The child reminded Genji of the heir apparent and made him long to see Fujitsubo's little son again. The desire so strongly possessed him that at last he sent Ai a message. "It is a long time since I have been to the palace or indeed paid any visits. I am beginning to feel the need of diversion, so today I am going out for a short while and would like to see you before I go. I do not want us to be completely cut off from one another." Thus he pleaded, and her ladies urged her that Prince Genji was her own dear lord, and she should not be so proud and stiff with him. She feared her illness had marred her looks and requested to speak with a curtain between, but her gentlewomen would not allow this. He brought a stool near where she lay and began to speak on various matters. Occasionally she put in a word or two, but it was plain she remained very weak. Yet it was hard to believe she had so recently seemed near death. They spoke quietly of those worst days of her illness, and how they now seemed like an evil dream, when suddenly he recalled the extraordinary conference he had had with her when she lay apparently at death's door, and filled with a sudden bitterness, he said, "There are many other things that I must one day talk to you about. But you seem very tired, and perhaps I had better go." So saying, he arranged her pillows, brought her warm water to wash, and in truth played the sick nurse so deftly that those about her wondered where he had learned the art. Still peerlessly beautiful, but weak and listless, she lay at times almost to fade from existence. He watched her with fond concern. Her hair, every ringlet still in place, was spread upon the pillow. Never before had her marvelous beauty so strangely impressed him. Could he have been so complacent for years, allowing such a woman to remain estranged from him? He remained gazing. "I must be off to the palace," he said at last, "but I shall not be long. Now you are better, you must try to make your mother less anxious when she comes, for though she strives not to show it, she is terribly distressed about you. You must set yourself now to sit up for a little each day. I think it is in part because she spoils you that you take so long to recover." As he left, robed in the splendor of his court attire, she followed him with her eyes more intently than ever before. The attendance of the officers in the autumn session was required, and Ai's father accompanied Genji to the palace, as did her brother, who needed the minister's help with arrangements for the coming political year. Many servants went as well, and the great hall wore a lonely, melancholy aspect. Suddenly, Ai was seized with that same choking fit as before, and was once more in desperate condition. The news reached Genji at the palace, and breaking off his audience, he hastened home. The rest followed in hot haste, and though it was appointment evening, they abandoned attendance, knowing the tragic turn at the great hall would suffice as excuse. It was too late to fetch the abbot from Mount Tendai or any of the dignitaries who had aided before. It was appalling that just when she seemed to have improved, she should so suddenly again stand at death's door, and those at the great hall felt utterly helpless and bewildered. The house filled with lackeys arriving from every side with messages of sympathy and inquiry. But from the inhabitants of that stricken house, they could draw no information, for they seemed to do nothing but rush from room to room in a panic terrifying to behold. Remembering several times already, the possession had reduced her to a trance-like state. They for a time did not attempt to lay out the body or even touch her pillows, but left her as she was. After 2 or 3 days, however, it became clear that life was extinct. Amid the general lamentations that followed, Genji's spirit sank into the numbness of utter despair. Sorrow had succeeded sorrow too swiftly. Life as he saw it was but a succession of futile miseries. The messages of condolence pouring in from the most exalted quarters of court and city merely fatigued and irritated him. The warmth of the old ex-emperor's messages and his manifest personal distress at Ai's death were indeed flattering and mingled a small sense of gratification with her father's perpetual weeping. At the suggestion of a friend, various drastic measures were tried in the hope of kindling some spark of life in the body. But it soon became plain, even to reluctant eyes, that it was too late, and heavy at heart they bore the body to Toraibno. There, in the great open cremation, ground beyond the town, the horrors they had dreaded were quickly begun. Even in that vast space, there was scarcely room for the crowds of mourners who had come from the great palaces to follow the bier, and for the throngs of priests who, chanting liturgies, flocked from neighboring temples. The ex-emperor was represented. So were Princess Kakiden and the heir apparent. Many other important people came in person and mingled with the crowd. Never had a funeral aroused so universal an outpouring of interest and sympathy. Her father was not present. Now, in my declining years, to have lost one so young and strong is a blow too staggering, he said, and could no longer restrain the tears he strove to conceal. His grief was heart-rending. All night the mournful ceremonies continued, but at last only a few pitiful ashes remained on the pyre, and in the morning the mourners went home. It was, save for its splendor, much like any other funeral. Yet it so happened that, save in one case only, death had not yet come Genji's way, and the scenes of that day haunted him long afterwards with hideous persistence. The ceremony took place in the last week of the 8th month. Seeing that for Ai's father the soft brightness of the autumn morning was shrouded in the twilight of despair, and well aware what thoughts must be passing through his mind, Genji went to him and, pointing to the sky, murmured this verse: "Because of all the mists that wreathe the autumn sky, I know not which ascended from my lady's bier. Henceforth upon the country of the clouds from pole to pole I gaze with love. At last he returned to his room. He lay down but could not sleep. His thoughts ranged over the years he had known her. Why had he been content to assume that in the end, all would be right, and meanwhile amused himself regardless of her anger? Why had he let year after year pass, without even at the very end, establishing any true intimacy or sympathy between them? Bitter remorse filled his heart, but what good was it? His servants brought his light gray mourner's robe, and a strange thought crossed his mind. What if I had died instead and not she? She would be putting on the woman mourner's deep dyed robe, and he recited the poem. Though light in hue the dress which in bereavement custom bids me wear, yet black my sorrow as the gown thou wouldst have worn. And clad thus he told his rosary, those about him noting that even the somber hues of mourning could not make him look wan or dull. He read many sutras in a low voice, among them the liturgy to Samantabhadra as dispenser of the Dharmadhatu Samadhi, which he recited with an earnestness more impressive in its way than the practiced intonation of a professional cleric. Next, he visited the newborn child and took some comfort in reflecting that she had at least left this memorial of their love. Genji did not try to go even for a day to the Nijo Inn, but remained buried in memories and regrets with no occupation save arranging masses for her soul. He did, however, write a few letters, among them one to Rokujo. The virgin-elect was already in charge of the guardsmen of the gate, and would soon be passed by them to the palace in the fields. Rokujo therefore made her daughter's position an excuse for sending no reply. He was now so weary of life and its afflictions that he seriously contemplated taking priestly vows, and might perhaps have done so had there not been a new tie seeming to bind him irrevocably to the world. But hold, there was Murasaki too, waiting for him in a wing of his palace. How unhappy she must have been all this long time. That night, lying alone within his royal curtains though watchmen paced not far away, he felt very lonely, and remembering that autumn is no time to lie alone, he summoned the sweetest, voiced among the palace chaplains. His chanting mingled with early dawn, and was of almost unendurable beauty. Yet soon the melancholy of late autumn and the murmur of the rising wind possessed him, and unused to lonely nights, he found it hard to keep his bed till morning. Looking out, he saw a heavy mist over the garden beds. Yet despite the fog, it was clear something was tied to the stem of a fine chrysanthemum nearby. It was a letter on dark blue paper. The messenger had left it there and gone. What a charming idea, he thought when he recognized the hand. It was from Rokujo. She began that, having regard to her daughter's situation, she did not suppose he would be surprised at her long delay in answering his earlier note. She added an acrostic poem in which, playing on Kiku, chrysanthemum, she told him of her distress at hearing Kiku of his bereavement. The beauty of the morning, she ended, turned my thoughts more than ever towards you and your sorrow. That is why I could not but answer you. It was written more elegantly than usual, but he tossed it aside. Her condolences wounded him, for after what he had seen, he knew they could not be sincere. Still, he felt it would be harsh to break off all intercourse with her. That would in fact tend to incriminate her, and that was the last thing he wished. After all, perhaps it was not that at all which had brought about the disaster. Maybe Ai's fate was sealed in any case. If only he had chanced never to witness or hear the fatal operation of her spirit. As it stood, argue as he might, he doubted whether he could ever efface the impression of what had been revealed in that hideous scene. He had the excuse that he was still in deep mourning, and that to receive a letter from him might inconvenience her during her daughter's purification. But after long reflection, he decided it would be cruel not to answer a letter clearly written solely to console him, and on paper, lightly tinted brown, he wrote, "Though I have let many days slip by, believe me, you have not been absent from my thoughts. If I was slow to answer, it was because, as a mourner, I was loath to trespass upon the sanctity now surrounding your home, and this I trusted you would understand. Do not brood excessively over what has happened, for go we late or soon, more frail our lives than dew, drops hanging in the morning light. For the present, think of it no more. I say this now because it is not possible for us to meet. She received the letter at her daughter's place of preparation, but did not read it till she was back at her own house. At a glance, she knew what he was hinting. So he too accused her. And at last, the hideous conviction of her guilt forced itself upon her acceptance. Her misery increased tenfold. If even Genji had reason to suspect her guilt, her brother, in law the ex-emperor, must already have been informed. What was he thinking of her? Her dead husband, Prince Zembo, had been the brother he had loved most. He had accepted guardianship of the little girl who was now to be consecrated, and at his brother's earnest entreaty, had promised to undertake her education and indeed treat her as though she were his own child. The old emperor had constantly invited the widowed lady and her daughter to live with him in the palace, but she was reluctant to accept this offer, which indeed was somewhat impracticable. Meanwhile, she allowed herself to listen to Genji's youthful addresses and lived in constant torment and agitation, lest her indiscretion be discovered. During the whole period of this escapade, she was in such a state of mingled excitement and apprehension that she scarcely knew what she was doing. In the world at large, she enjoyed the reputation of great beauty, and this, combined with her exalted lineage, brought to the palace in the fields, as soon as it was known she had repaired there with her daughter, a host of frivolous dandies from court who made it their business to thrust upon her fashionable attentions morning, noon, and night. Genji heard of this and blamed them not. He could only think it 1,000 pities that a woman endowed with every talent and charm should conceive she had done with the world and prepare to withdraw to so remote a spot. He conceived she would find Ys unbearably dull when she arrived. Though the masses for Ai's soul were over, he remained in retirement until the end of the 7 weeks. He was unused to idleness, and the time weighed heavily upon him. Often he summoned To-no Chujo to hear news of the world, and amid much serious matter Chujo would sometimes distract him by recounting strange escapades they had shared. On one such occasion, he indulged in jests at the expense of the ancient lady of the bedchamber with whom Genji had so indiscreetly dallied. Poor old lady, Genji protested, it is cruel to mock her thus. Pray, do not. But he had to admit to himself he could never think of her without smiling. Then Chujo told the whole story of how he had followed and watched him on that autumn night, the first after the full moon, and many other tales of his own adventures and others. In the end, they fell to speaking of their common loss, and agreeing that life taken all in all was but a sad business, they parted in tears. Some weeks later, on a gloomy, wet evening, Chujo strode into the room somewhat self-conscious in the light gray winter cloak and breeches he wore for the first time. Genji leaned against the balcony balustrade above the main western door. For a long while he had been gazing at the frost-clad gardens about the house. A high wind blew, and swift showers dashed against the trees. Near to tears, he murmured to himself the line, "Tell me whether her soul be in the rain or whether in the clouds above." And as Chujo observed him, chin upon hand, he thought the soul of one wedded to so lovely a youth could not quite renounce her earthly scene, and must surely hover very near him. Still gazing with eager admiration, Chujo came to Genji's side. He saw that though his friend had not otherwise relaxed the plainness of his garb, he had today put on a colored sash. This streak of deep red showed against his gray cloak, which, though still a summer one, was of darker hue than the one he had lately worn, in an attractive way, so that, though very unlike the magnificent attires of happier days, Chujo could not for long take his eyes from him. At last he too looked up at the stormy sky, and remembering the Chinese verse Genji had once repeated, he recited, "Though to rain her soul be turned, Yet where in the clouded vault of heaven is that one mist, wreath which is she? And Genji replied, since she whom once we knew beyond the country of the clouds is fled, 2 months of storm and darkness now have seared the wintry earth below. The depth of Genji's feeling was plain. Sometimes Chujo had thought it was merely dread of the old emperor's rebukes, coupled with a sense of obligation toward Ai's father, whose kindness had always been so marked, and toward the princess his mother, who had cherished him with unfailing patience. That had made it hard for him to sever a relationship which in truth had become irksome. Often indeed Genji's apparent indifference to Ai had caused Chujo pain. Now it was clear she had never ceased to hold a place in his affections, and this made him lament more bitterly than ever the tragedy of her early death. Whatever he did, and wherever he went, he felt that a light was gone from his life, and he sank into despondency. The princess looked at her grandson's innocent, smiling face and thought that in beauty, he was not far behind the child she had lost. Already her tears fell faster than a stormy wind shakes down the dry leaves from a tree, and when she read Genji's message, they flowed still more freely. Her answer was, new tears, but tears of joy it brings this blossom from a meadow that is now laid waste. Still needing some small occupation to distract his thoughts, though it was already dark, he began a letter to Princess Asago, who he felt must long since have heard of his bereavement. Although it had been long since he had news from her, he made no reference to former intimacy. His letter was so formal that he allowed the messenger to read it before setting out. It was written on Chinese paper-tinted sky blue. With it he sent the poem, when I look back upon an autumn fraught with diverse sorrows, I find no dusk dimmed with such tears as I to-night have shed. He took great pains with his handwriting, and her ladies thought it a shame so elegant a note should be unanswered. In the end, she reached the same conclusion. Though my heart goes out to you in your affliction, she replied, I see no cause to abandon my distrust. And she added the poem, since I heard that the mists of autumn had vanished and left desolate winter in your house, I have thought often of you as I watched the streaming sky. This was all hastily written, but to Genji, who had long received no news from her, it gave as much pleasure as the longest ingenious epistle. It is the unexplored that commonly attracts us, and Genji tended to fall most deeply in love with those who granted him least encouragement. The ideal condition for the continuance of his affection was that the beloved, busied elsewhere, should grant him no more than an occasional favor. There was one who fit these conditions admirably, but alas, her high rank and conspicuous public position carried too many material difficulties. But little Murasaki was different. There was no need to cultivate her on that principle. He had not in the long weeks of mourning forgotten her, and knew she must be feeling dull without him. But he regarded her merely as an orphan child, whose care he had undertaken, and it comforted him to think that here at least was one he could leave for a while without anxiously fearing trouble. Night had fallen, and gathering the household about the great lamp, he bade them tell stories. Among them was a gentlewoman named Chunegin, with whom he had long been secretly in love. He still felt drawn to her, but at such a time there could be no thought of closer ties. Seeing him despondent, she came near, and after some talk of many matters, Genji said, during these last weeks, when all has been still in the house, I have grown so used to your company that if a time comes when we can no longer meet so often, I shall miss you greatly. That was why I was feeling particularly depressed, though indeed whichever way I turn my thoughts I find little consolation. Here he paused, and some of the ladies shed tears. At last one said, I know, my lord, how dark a cloud has fallen upon you and would not presume to compare our sorrow with yours. But remember what it must mean to us that henceforward you will never. Do not say never, answered Genji kindly. I do not forget my friends so readily as that. If there are any among you who, mindful of the past, wish still to serve in this house, they may count on it that while I live I shall never desert them. And as he sat gazing into the lamplight with tears glittering in his eyes, they felt fortunate indeed in having such a protector. Among these gentlewomen was a little orphan who had been Ai's favorite maid. Well aware how desolate the child must feel, he said kindly, "Whose business is it now but mine to look after little Miss Ate?" The girl burst into tears. In her short tunic, darker than the others' garments, with black neckerchief and dark blue breeches, she made a charming figure. "I hope," Genji continued, "there are some who, despite the dull times in this house, will choose, in memory of the past, to devote themselves to the care of the little prince I leave behind. If all who knew his mother are dispersed, his plight will be more wretched than before." Again, he promised never to forget them, but they knew well his visits would be few and far between, and felt despondent. That night he distributed among the waiting, ladies and all the servants of the great hall, according to their rank and need, various keepsakes and trifles that had belonged to their young mistress, giving to each whatever he thought most likely to keep her memory alive, regardless of his own preferences in the household. He had resolved he could not much longer follow this mode of life, and must soon return to his own palace. While his servants dragged out his coach and his gentlemen assembled before his rooms, as if to delay him on purpose, a violent rainstorm began, with wind tearing the last leaves from the trees and sweeping them wildly across the ground. The gentlemen assembled were soon drenched. He had meant to go to the palace, then to the Nijo Inn, and return to sleep at the great hall. But on such a night that was impossible, and he ordered his gentlemen to proceed straight to the Nijo Inn, where he would join them later. As they trooped off, each felt, though none likely saw the great hall again, that a chapter of his life had closed. Both the minister and his wife, hearing Genji would not return that night, felt they had reached a new and bitter stage in their grief. To Ai's mother, he sent this letter. "The ex-emperor has expressed a strong desire to see me, and I feel bound to go to the palace. Though I shall not be absent many days, yet it is long since I left this house, and I feel dazed at the prospect of facing the great world again. I could not go without informing you of my departure, but am in no state to pay you a visit." The princess lay with closed eyes, thoughts sunk in profoundest gloom. She sent no reply. Presently, Ai's father came to Genji's apartments. He found it hard to hold himself up, and during the interview clung to his son, in-law's sleeve with a dependence that was painfully touching. After much hesitation, he began, "We old men are prone to tears even when small matters are amiss. You must not marvel then that under so terrible a sorrow I at times break into weeping I cannot control. At such moments of weakness, I would rather be where none can see me, and that is why I have not yet ventured to pay my respects to your good father. If opportunity offers, I beg you to explain this to him. To be left desolate in the last years of life is a sore trial, a very sore trial indeed." The effort cost him, and Genji hastened to assure the old minister he would put matters right at court. "Though I do not doubt," he added, "my father has already surmised the reason for your absence." As it still rained heavily, the minister urged him to start before dark. But Genji would not go until he had taken a last look at the inner rooms. His father-in-law followed. In the space beyond Ai's curtained seat, packed behind a screen, some 30 gentlewomen all clad in dark gray weeds huddled together, forlorn and tearful. "These hapless ladies," said the minister to Genji, "though they take comfort in the thought that you leave behind one whose presence will sometimes draw you to this house, well know it will never again be your proper home, and this distresses them no less than the loss of their dear mistress. For years they had hoped you, and she would at last be reconciled. Consider then how bitter must be the day of your final departure for them. Let them take heart," said Genji, "for whereas while my lady lived I would often absent myself in the vain hope that upon my return I should find her less harsh, now that she is dead I have no further cause to shun this house, as you will soon find." When he watched Genji drive away, Ai's father went to her bedroom. All her things were as she had left them. On a stand before the bed, writing materials lay scattered. There were papers covered with Genji's handwriting, which the old man clasped with an eagerness that made some gentlewomen who followed him smile, even amid grief. The works Genji had copied were masterpieces of the past, some Chinese, some Japanese, some in cursive, some in full script. They formed an astonishing display of versatile penmanship. The minister gazed with an almost religious awe at these specimens of Genji's skill, and the thought that he must henceforth regard the young man he adored as no longer a member of his household and family must in that moment have been very painful. AI's ladies clustered in small groups, each some gentlewoman pouring out private griefs and vexations. No doubt, as the minister told us, Prince Genji will come sometimes, if only to see the child. But for my part, I doubt whether he will find much comfort in such visits, one said to her friends. Soon there were many affecting scenes of farewell, for it was decided they should for the present go back to their homes. Meanwhile, Genji was with his father in the palace. "You are very thin in the face," said the ex-emperor on seeing him. "I fear you have exhausted your strength by too much prayer and fasting." And in deep concern, he at once pressed viands and cordials upon him, showing solicitude for his health and affairs that moved Genji. Late that night he reached the Nijo Inn. There he found everything garnished and swept. His men servants and maids waited at the door. All the gentlewomen of the household presented themselves in his rooms. They seemed to have vied which should look gayest and smartest, their finery contrasting pleasantly with the somber attire of the unfortunate ladies he had left at the great hall. After changing out of his court dress, he went to the western wing. Murasaki's winter costume was daintily made, and her pretty waiting, maids and little companions were so handsomely equipped as to reflect great credit on Shanagan's management. He saw with satisfaction that such matters might safely be left to her. Murasaki herself was exquisitely dressed. "How tall you have grown since I saw you last," he said, and pulled up her little curtain of honor. He had been away so long, she felt shy and turned her head aside. But he would not have had her look otherwise, for as she sat in profile with lamplight upon her face, he realized with delight she was becoming the very image of her whom from the first he had loved best. Coming close, he whispered, "Sometime I will tell you all that has befallen me since I went away. But it has been terrible, and I am too tired to speak of it now, so I will go and rest a while in my own room. From tomorrow onward you will have me all day. Indeed, I expect you will soon tire of me." So far, so good, thought Shanagan when she heard this remark. Yet she remained uneasy. She knew several great ladies with whom Genji was friendly, and feared that when he came to choose a second wife, he would prefer one of them to her little mistress, and she was far from satisfied. When Genji had retired to the eastern wing, he sent for a certain Lady Chujo to rub his limbs, and then went to bed. Next morning, he wrote to the nurses of AI's child, and received back a touching account of its beauty and progress, but the letter only awakened useless memories. Toward the end of the day, he felt restless, and time hung heavily on his hands, yet he was in no mood to resume secret wanderings, and such a thought did not occur to him. In Murasaki, none of his hopes had been disappointed. She had grown into as handsome a girl as one could wish, and was no longer at an age that made a lover impossible. He constantly hinted at his meaning, but she seemed not to understand. He had much time on his hands, and spent it all in her company. All day they played draughts or word, picking, and even in these trivial pastimes she showed quickness and a gentle charm that continually delighted him. Yet she had been raised in strict seclusion, and never occurred to her to turn her charms to more adult use. Soon the situation became unbearable, and though he knew she would be upset, he determined somehow to have his way. One morning, the gentleman was up and about, but the young lady still abed. Her attendants had no reason to suspect anything amiss, for it had always been Genji's habit to enter and leave her room as he pleased. They assumed she felt unwell, and looked at her with sympathy when Genji arrived carrying a writing box which he slipped behind the bed curtains. He at once retired, and the ladies left the room. Seeing herself alone, Murasaki raised her head slowly. There by her pillow lay the writing box, and tied to it with ribbon a slender note. Listlessly she untied the note, and unfolding it, read the hastily scribbled poem. Too long have we deferred this new emprise, who night by night till now have lain but with a shift between. That this was what Genji had so long sought surprised her utterly, and she could not understand why he should regard the unpleasant event of last night as in some way the beginning of a new and closer friendship. Later in the morning, he came again. "Is something the matter with you?" he asked. "I shall be very dull today if you cannot play draughts with me." But when he drew near, she buried herself further under the bedclothes. He waited till the room was empty and then, bending over her, said, "Why are you treating me so sulkily? I little expected to find you in such a bad mood this morning. The others will find it odd if you lie here all day." And he pulled aside the scarlet coverlet beneath which she had hidden. To his astonishment, she was bathed in sweat. Even the hair across her cheeks was dripping. "No. This is too much," he said. "What a state you have worked yourself into." But try as he might to coax her back, she would speak no word, for she was truly upset. "Very well then," he said at last. "If that is how you feel, I will never come to see you again," and feigned mortification. Turning away, he opened the writing box to see whether she had replied to his poem, but found none. He understood her distress as due to extreme youth and inexperience, and was not in the least angry. He sat near her all day, striving to win back her confidence, and though he had little success, he found her rebuffs curiously endearing. At nightfall, being the day of the wild boar, festival cakes were served. Owing to Genji's bereavement, no great display was made, but a few were brought to Murasaki's quarters in an elegant picnic basket. Seeing the different kinds mixed together, Genji went into the front part of the house and, calling Koremitsu, said, "Take these cakes away and bring me some more tomorrow evening, only not so many as this, and all of one kind. This is not the right evening for them." He smiled as he spoke, and Koremitsu, quick-witted, guessed what had happened. He did not think it discreet to congratulate his master outright, and merely said, "It is true. If you wish a good beginning, you must eat your cakes on the proper day. The day of the rat is certainly fitting. How many shall I bring?" When Genji replied, "Divide by 3, and you will get the answer," Koremitsu was no longer in doubt and hastened away, leaving Genji amused at the practiced air with which he handled such matters. He told no one, but, returning to his private house, made the cakes himself. Genji began to despair of restoring her confidence. Yet even now, when she seemed as shy as on the night he first took her from her home, her beauty enchanted him, and he knew his old affection was but a fraction of what he now felt since yesterday. How strange is the human heart! For now it would have seemed a calamity if even for a single night he had been parted from Murasaki's side, and but a short while ago. Koremitsu brought the cakes Genji had ordered very late the following night. He would not entrust them to Shanagan, fearing such a commission might embarrass a mature woman. Instead, he sent for her daughter Miss Ben, and putting all the cakes in a large perfume box, bade her take them secretly to her mistress. Be sure to set them close by her pillow, for they are lucky cakes and must not be left about the house. Promise me not to do anything silly with them. Miss Ben thought this odd, but tossed her head and said, "When, pray, did you ever find me silly?" and walked off with the box. Being quite young and innocent of such matters, she marched straight to her mistress's bed, and remembering Koremitsu's instructions, pushed the box through the curtains and placed it by the pillow. It seemed to her someone else was with Murasaki. No doubt, she thought, Prince Genji has come as usual to hear her repeat her lessons. As yet no one in the household but Koremitsu knew of the betrothal. But when next day the box was found by the bed, and brought into the servants' quarters. Some close to their master's affairs at once guessed the secret. Whence came these little dishes, each on its own carved stand? Who had taken such pains to make these dainty, ingenious cakes? Shanagan, though shocked at this casual route into matrimony, was overjoyed to learn Genji's strange patronage had culminated in a formal betrothal, and her eyes brimmed with grateful tears. All the same, she thought he might have told her old nurse first, and there was grumbling in the household that an outside retainer like Koremitsu had wind of it before them. In the days that followed, he grudged even the short hours, attendance he owed at the palace and in his father's rooms, finding, to his surprise, that except in her presence he could no longer enjoy a moment's peace. Friends he had been wont to visit were surprised and took offense at this unexplained neglect, but though he had no wish to offend them, he now found even the remotest prospect of having to leave his palace one night enough to throw him out of gear. While during his absence, his spirits sank, and he looked as though he were taking ill from some strange malady. To all invitations or greetings, he replied that he was at present in no mood for company, which was taken as reference to his recent loss, or that someone awaited him and he must go. The minister of the right knew his youngest daughter still pined for Genji and said one day to Princess Kokiden, "While his wife lived, we of course discouraged her friendship with him. But the position is altered, and I feel there would be much to be said for such a match." But Kokiden had long hated Genji, and having arranged her sister's entry to the palace, she saw no reason to abandon that plan. Indeed, from that moment, she became resolved that the girl should be given to the emperor, and to no other. Genji still retained a certain partiality for her, but though it grieved him to hear she was unhappy, he had at present no spare affection to offer. Life, he concluded, was too short for diversions and experiments, henceforward he would concentrate. He had moreover received a terrible warning of the dangers that might spring from the jealousies and resentments his former life had entailed. He thought of Lady Rokujo's distress with tenderness and concern, but it was clear he must beware of letting her regard him as her refuge. If, however, she would renew their friendship on new terms, permitting him her company and conversation at times he could conveniently arrange, there was no reason they might not sometimes meet. Society at large knew someone lodged with him, but her identity was unknown. This mattered little. Genji felt he ought sooner or later to let her father, Prince Hyabukyo, know what had become of her, and decided it would be best to celebrate her initiation first. This was done privately, but with every detail observed in due splendor and solemnity. And though the outside world was not invited, it was as magnificent an affair as could be. Yet since their betrothal, Murasaki showed a certain shyness and reserve in his presence. She could not help feeling sorry that after long years of close friendship, he had suddenly conceived this strange notion, and whenever their eyes met, she hastily averted them. He tried to make light of it, but to her, it was grave indeed and weighed on her. Her changed demeanor was somewhat comic yet distressing, and one day he said, "Sometimes it seems you have forgotten all our long years of friendship, and that I have become as new to you as at the start." And while thus he chided her, the year drew to a close. On New Year's Day, he paid the customary visits of ceremony to his father, to the emperor, and to the heir apparent. Next he visited the Great Hall. The old minister made no mention of the new year, but immediately spoke of the past. In the midst of his loneliness and sorrow, he was so moved by this long-deferred visit that though he strove to keep composure, he could not. Looking fondly at his son, in law he thought each passing year but added new beauty to that fair face. They entered the inner rooms together, where his appearance surprised and rejoiced the desolate ladies who had remained. Then they visited the little prince, growing into a fine child. His merry face gave pleasure. His likeness to the heir apparent was striking, and Genji wondered whether it had been observed. Ai's belongings remained as she had left them. His New Year clothes, as in former years, were hung on the clothes frame. Ai's clothes frame beside it stood empty and with a strangely desolate air. A letter from the princess, her mother, came. "Today," she wrote, "our bereavement was more keenly upon my mind, and though touched by your visit, I fear to see you would but call up unhappy recollections. You will remember," she continued, "it was my custom to present you a suit of clothes each New Year's Day. But these past months, my sight is dimmed with tears, and I fear you will think I have matched the colors very ill. Nevertheless, I beg, though it be but for today, you will suffer yourself to be disfigured by this unfashionable garb." And a servant held out a second suit, which evidently he was expected to wear. The under stuff was of an unusual pattern and mixture of colors, and displeased him. Yet he could not let her feel she had labored in vain, and he at once put the suit on. It was fortunate he had come to the great hall that day, for he could see she had counted upon it. In his reply, he said, "Though I came hoping you would be the first friend I greet at this springtide, now that I am here too many bitter memories assail me, and I think it wiser we should not meet." To this, he added an acrostic poem in which he said that with the mourning dress he had just discarded, so many years of friendship were cast aside that were he to see her he could but weep. She answered with an acrostic poem, saying that in this new season, when all things bore altered hue, one thing alone remained, as in months gone by, her longing for the child who, like the passing year, had vanished from their sight. But though hers may have been the deeper sorrow, we must not imagine there was not at that moment deep feeling on both sides.